Okay, hopefully we are live. Welcome everyone to my medieval sewing party. I am the creative Contessa and I am coming to you from Daegu, South Korea because as you all know, I spend a lot of time out in the world, out and about. So first off, of course, as always, let us check the sound. If you are out there, please let me know whether you can hear me or not and how the sound quality is. Because I'm using Restream today, I am not going to be using the microphone, so we're relying on the internal microphone of my device. So we'll see how that goes. First, of course, as always, we're going to start with the traditional getting dressed. So the very first thing I do before I show up here is putting on my smock. This is my newest smock, and as you can see, I made it way too big. It is, I don't know what happened with the measurements when I took the measurements or I laid it out. I don't know, it's way too big. It's big enough for someone who is probably 5 sizes bigger than I am. I'm probably just going to leave it this way, though. I don't really feel like investing energy into fixing this one when I can make it work as is. And I will just therefore put my efforts into making other ones because by the time August comes around, I'm going to be in desperate need of more smocks. Almost all of my old linen smocks are now at the point of the fabric is ready to be turned into rag paper. Not even cut down into a smaller garment, just rag paper. So we might stay tuned for a how to make medieval rag paper with the creative Contessa coming to a live stream near you. Okay, so next on top of this layer comes my kirtel. There's almost as many spellings as there are potential pronunciations. And this is basically the word for the garment that is the intermediary layer. We know that this garment still counted as underwear in the Middle Ages in the 14th and 15th century because we have court criminal cases, as I've mentioned before, that reference women, weird kinds of court cases that reference women being abducted naked in naught but their smokka and kirtele, these two layers, which tells us that in the medieval imagination, this was not fully dressed for a lady. Now, if you're a servant, if you're a farmer, a peasant, in other words, then yeah, this is probably sufficient, or if you're a laborer and you're doing some kind of, work that is either sweaty or somehow dirty, like for women, pottery making would be a sweaty and dirty, dirty job. But for ladies, capital L, members of the aristocratic class or the upper class, the patrician class, it's very clear that this is considered not fully dressed. So when I say I'm wearing my underwear on my live streams, I mean it. By medieval standards, I am wearing my underwear. And this is as far dressed as we're going to get today because the gowns that come over top of this are those gowns with the really long trains that you see in a lot of the Flemish and French art from this era, and the vacation apartment that we have rented, the vacation rental that we have, isn't actually big enough for my overgowns. The trains on my overgowns are too big for this apartment. They literally just get wrapped around the furniture. So this is as far as I'll get dressed. Now I might do at some point here, I might go ahead once I get my valet back, I might do a getting dressed in all the layers live stream, just for those of you who want to see the whole process from the skin out, more recently presented. But if you want to see what this should look like with all the layers, on my YouTube channel, there is a getting dressed like a 15th century princess video that shows from the skin out, in fact, including stockings, including hair, including jewelry, including headdress, all the layers. And it provides in-depth information about all of the layers as presented and researched from primary sources only. So if you want to know what the rest of this outfit should look like, then you can check that out. It's if you do the search, I think if you do a search for Burgundian, it should bring it up, but it's about 26 minutes long. So it's, not very long considering that actually the whole process in terms of time takes about an hour, including hair. Okay, so we're all laced up, but this isn't all. I've got my hair already in braids. These are actually my sleeping braids. This is how I sleep with my hair. And I actually read a very interesting section in an essay on medieval etiquette, of all places. There was an excerpt from a story, an Italian, medieval Italian story, a kind of romance-ish, in which the undressing of the lady is described. And this story, I think, dates to the 14th century. And so the undressing of a queen is actually described in fair detail. And it actually says that her ladies, her damsels, actually put her hair up in curls on her head, basically pin her hair up in curls. Now, curls could be interpreted in a wide variety of ways. I need to find, this was unfortunately I have to go back and look at the original Italian. That was a 19th century English antiquarian translation. So I have to go back and look at the original Italian. But either way, the interesting detail is that it was, as I do every night, actually, ladies in the Middle Ages put their hair up to sleep. So it's little details like that that I love to find in these sources. And that was a very exciting one recently. And that I found it, and this is why I always tell people, if you want to understand medieval material culture, you have to read a huge array of sources beyond your specific little topic of interest. Because I was actually looking into table manners, medieval table manners. And actually, I wasn't even looking into table manners. I was looking into medieval hygiene. And that led me to this Victorian compilation of books of etiquette from the Middle Ages, many of which I'd never even heard of before. And that led me to read this passage that's hypothetically referring to table etiquette, but this whole passage referred to the undressing to prepare for bed. So that was that I had to get this information about getting dressed or undressed in daily medieval life by first looking for medieval hygiene. Like, that's a path you wouldn't necessarily think that's going to take you there. And lo, I found myself there. Okay, Laurie, thank you for being here. Happy New Year, everyone. Mistress V, so lovely to see you. Yeah, welcome everyone. Welcome to 2026. Here's hoping that this year brings a lot more joy to the household of the Quintessa than last year did. Okay, so I'm going to actually add one more piece. I'm going to add some bling, and I'm going to show you the options that we have. So this is a simple one. This is sort of a much more modest pendant, right? This was made by a friend of mine for me as a surprise. And you will see this model in a lot of portraits, not just from Flanders, but also from Florence, if you start looking for it. That's one option. The next option is the jewel that is a replica of one that was owned by Beatrice d'Este. This one is made by Armor and Castings. I just love the detail on the back. Right, isn't that gorgeous? This one is made by Armor and Castings. I think it was only $50, so it's pretty reasonable for this beautiful piece of jewelry. Yes, these are glass. These are glass. They're not real gems. I don't even think they're lab grown. I think these are glass. Funny story about that in a moment. And then the most splendid piece, the one you all love to see so much. Well, most of you love to see, and others get very consternated when I wear just this with just my kirtle. The Maria Portinari collar of fame, right? Okay, so which one shall I wear? And this one is also made by Armor and Castings. It's currently it's not cheap, but the amount of work that goes into making this is worth every penny that they're charging for it. Okay, so I think today I'm actually going to go for the simple one, just for ease of moving around, because the Maria Portinari collar is actually quite, go with the Beatrice d'Este jewel. The Maria Portinari collar is quite heavy. It is very heavy. And it's not necessarily unpleasant, but it's noticeable and can be sometimes a little distracting, especially if the clasp comes undone. Okay, so Beatrice d'Este jewel for the win. So I've got a funny story about these jewels. So this, you see this one? This beautiful Nouch pendant, right? Also an Armor and Castings piece. So I had one of these originally with a red gem, and this is very clearly now a purple gem. And that's because I had one with a red gem and I had a second gem. Both of these are based on the by originals owned by Margaret of York and Mary of Burgundy, right? And I had one in red, and I had another of Mary of Burgundy's jewels that's depicted on her hoods with a beautiful blue stone. And I was traveling back from Penzik a year and a half ago, and I unpacked my luggage, and lo, they were missing from the jewelry box. So they were stolen, I'm pretty certain, by whatever airport security ransacked through my luggage. So lesson learned, if you're traveling, put any jewelry in your carry-on, seriously. But the funny thing for them is I'm confident they stole it thinking, oh, look at this gem. They're not gems. This is not worth I mean, yes, they're lovely and they're not cheap per se, but they're not worth tens of thousands of dollars. And so I'm pretty certain they were very angry when they took it to fence it and found out that it wasn't worth anything, basically, on the black market. You know what I mean? So yeah, if you're interested in purchasing any of these beautiful pieces from Armor and Castings, check out armorandcastings.com and use the code Contessa10 and you'll get an extra 10% off. Okay, well, just going to put on some rings also, which I took off for working out. And then we will be ready to sew. So welcome everyone to the sewing party. I am going to be working on my new Burgundian gown. Oh, I did not plan this well. Sorry. I didn't think about how the legs of the camera were intertwined with the legs of the light. Okay, so I'm going to be working on my new continuing to work on my new Burgundian gown. I also wanted to show everyone the progress on my not a hennin, right? The iconic so-called princess hat, what many of you call a hennin, but was never ever called that in the 15th century. There's zero evidence for this headdress ever being called a hennin. And so this is where we're at right now. I have attached, I cut open the seam on the outside and I folded it and pinned it. And so now all I have to do is whip stitch that in place and then decide how I'm going to finish the top. There's a couple of options I have on how to finish off the top here. I could just turn it in like this and just put little whip stitches in there if I can reach in, which I think I can. Or I could fold both of these edges in towards each other, so that it's completely, and then do a stab stitch or a whip stitch around the top, which is what I might ultimately go for. I haven't decided yet. There's a couple of options and I have to kind of think about that a little bit more. But what's a little frustrating is that even though this was cut to match exactly, the curve of the vellum foundation was cut to match, or the fabric was cut to match the curve of the vellum exactly. Somehow when I tucked the edges in and did all of those little stab stitches, we ended up with a little bit of lip here where it's not the same all the way around. So it fits tightly here in the back on the bottom, no problem, but there's no amount of pulling up I can do that will actually bring this to neatly seat flush against the vellum. So there's a couple of options I have there, and I think I'm just going to take the easiest one, which is just to fold this little lip under and then whip stitch it inside in place. I'm definitely not taking out all these perfect little tiny stab stitches. Not happening. There is very little more soul stealing for me than doing beautiful hand stitching and then having to cut it and redo it. Yeah. Okay, so let me just make sure that the chat is actually showing me everything. So is anyone else working on any projects this evening? Let me know. So the other thing on which I'm working and which I'm going to specifically work on today, because I think I might need to fiddle with this a little more to get it a little tight. It's mostly flush. But I'm just worried about it being maybe not quite tight enough. So in the lateral direction. So I might have to just pull that and repin it a little bit more. Now, what I know I don't want to do, is overstretch this fabric, because then it's going to make it overly taut and then it will be more prone to literal wear and tear. That being said, this silk cover is just an intermediary cover. My plan was and is still to actually make a secondary cover that will be elaborate and ornate, that will be covered in pearls and gold thread. So that will then be able to just slip on over top of this and either be held in place by pins possibly or little whip stitches, and then it can be removed and I can make multiple covers. I can make one in velvet, for instance. So then I have options, different options for this same base, right? That just makes sense to me from a medieval perspective of why would you need multiple cones if you can have one single cone and then you have covers that can just be pinned on. You know, the medieval dress world was such a pin was such a pin economy, right? A lot of garments like this, for instance, like I could easily, you notice how I'm fiddling with this because it doesn't fit quite right. Well, if I really want to make this sit so that it's always sitting exactly perfectly, then I would just, as a medieval lady, I would just put some pins in here, not safety pins, pins that look exactly like this. Right, this is a replica of all these pins that dressing pins that have both survived in the archaeological record and are represented in art. So yeah, if I really feel strongly about making sure that, for instance, always the same amount of white is showing on both sides of the garment, then I can just put in some pins and everything will be held in place. And of course, one of your questions is probably going to be, well, isn't that going to mean you're going to poke yourself? No. It does not. Now, what could happen if I'm not tracking these pins, right, is that I could rub my fingers the wrong way over it, and that can be dangerous. But my theory is that because this is how people dressed every day with all of these pins, pin money, that's where the term pin money comes from. It's a separate line item in accounts by the 16th century, right? So the reason that they probably weren't always tearing their fingers open on the pins in their garments is because they grew up with pins and they knew to be aware of it. Whereas we modern people are accustomed to clothes that are 100% convenience with Velcro and zippers and buttons and snaps that we never think, we have no awareness anymore. We have a much lower awareness anyway of what we're actually doing with our bodies. Right, so medieval people just grew up with a different level of awareness of the dangers of their own clothes, whereas we're used to clothes with not a single bit of risk, more or less. Okay, so because I'm going to be talking to you, which means I'm not going to be paying the closest attention, I'm not going to leave those pins in there. So normally, for me, the pins that end up covered, right? If I put these pins in here, if I were getting dressed, and I wanted to make sure that, the whole way, putting the overgarment on, then I could absolutely take this pin, put it here, and then the overdress would go over top of that, and it would protect me from the pin because the overdress wouldn't have pins that were just exposed. That being said, if you really start looking at portraits, especially the portraits done by the Flemish artists, the Burgundian artists, right? If you start looking at their paintings closely, you're going to start seeing pins everywhere. You're going to see them in the headdresses. You're going to see them in various parts of the dresses themselves, the gowns, men as well as women, right? So start looking and you're going to start seeing pins that maybe you didn't notice before because your brain decided that couldn't possibly be a pin. Okay. Let me see. King Henry's court is currently planning out 2 protests. I'm figuring out how to make a French hood, and I'm also figuring out what accessories, jewelry I need to make for my friend's Anne Boleyn outfit. So, you know, the thing about those hoods, about hoods in any 15th or 16th century, this is where a lot of people are actually going wrong, is that they're trying to make a single hat. They're trying to make a single headdress. But I don't think that they were. I don't think that the French hoods were a single layer. I think they were multiple layers. So you're going to, again, that gives you flexibility, right? You don't always have to have the same thing framing your face with the same hood that's framing your hair. So I think I haven't really looked into the 16th century stuff in years at this point. But the last time I looked at it, my feeling was that those were all separate layers. They weren't all stitched together conveniently as one thing. Yeah. Let me see. I'm working on my first camicia to go under a gamora that I was gifted. Very cool. I'll have to fix the gamora as the person who gave it is much smaller in the chest area than I am. Dana, does the gamora have front lacing or side lacing? If so, you might not have to fix it. You might just have a gap. You might just have your lacing be an open V if it has front lacing, which is very, very common in gamora of this era. They were designed, these gamore, these kirtles, the gamora is the 15th century Italian equivalent of the kirtle. These foundational layers were specifically designed to be flexible because women were changing size on a fairly regular basis if they were married women because they were in various states of pregnancy, which is going to cause your breasts to swell or to shrink. It's going to cause your hips to swell or to shrink, your belly to swell or to shrink. So these laces, these places where you have lacings, now we want them all to be neatly closed, but that wasn't how it was in the 15th century. Oh, it has back lacing. Ah, shit. Okay, so Dana, I'm going to suggest, okay, back lacing is not medieval. And there's practical reasons for that. It's back lacing is completely inconvenient. You have to have someone to help you lace up the back. It also offers less opportunities for support and adjustability. So I would actually, if you currently have a medieval gown that is backlaced, I would stitch that shut. I just whip stitch it closed, and then I would open up a front seam and add lacing into the front. That would be my suggestion. Now, if it also has a gap in your waist, that's actually also, that was also a thing. You can often see where the lacing does not shut at the waist. In fact, I just posted a portrait on both my Facebook and my YouTube community posts where you can see that the V of the opening actually continues down past the waist all the way to where the dress actually shuts. Yeah, side lacing is also an option. And again, the same thing applies. You don't have to worry about it closing as long as you're comfortable in it. Yep. Side lacing is a good option. Front lacing is an option. The nice thing about front lacing is then you only have to worry about one opening and one set of laces to redo it. If you have side lacing, then you need to have both sides open. Yeah. But yeah, okay. So yeah, and why is back lacing not a thing? If you think about it, back lacing means you always have to have someone there to help you always. Now in a medieval world, that's less of a problem than it would be for modern people. In the modern world, we live very isolated from each other. And in the medieval world, most 99.9% of the population lived communally. So you lived multiple people in a home, you lived multiple generations in a home. Even lower middle class people had a servant. So it was a completely different social construct, which meant that you didn't have to worry quite so much about people not being there to help you. But even still, backlacing is annoying. Yeah. I've seen like one example I can think of in the late 15th century of what could be interpreted as backlacing, and that's kind of it. Yeah. Okay, so what am I working on then right now? I am working on the sleeves for my new, what many of you might call the Burgundian gown. And this is that gown that is worn typically with the mitre, as they were called in English, the princess hat, right? This style of hat, that kind of gown. And they're called a Burgundian gown because the Burgundian court was the most powerful court in this era. And I just wanted to show you, now that the sleeve is together, I wanted to show you how it looks because I am actually wearing the right gown, the right style of gown. It's inside out, mind you. So don't mind that. Okay, so this is how it will look. And I think I've got it on the right arm, the correct arm, right? So this is how it will look. And you'll notice it's designed to fit over top of my kirtle, right? So there's actually room here for my kirtle sleeve. Very important. And yet it's also very nicely fitted through the arms. You can see we've got nice shaping here, right? The shaping is less obvious because you've got the flaps of the hem, the seams, a seam allowance, which I'm about to whip stitch down. So that's what I'm going to be working on. I'm actually going to be finishing the seam allowance here by just whip stitching it to the silk. Now, unfortunately, I mean, not fortunately or unfortunately, I made this up and I lined it in silk because I know in many of the Scottish Royal inventories, there are lots of expense entries for silk to line sleeves and to line the bodice. So that's where I'm going with that. But I realized after I lined it that if I had left it unlined, I could have made the sleeve even tighter actually. And the wool has its own natural amount of elasticity that it would have actually had more give. The silk automatically removes the give. But there it is. I'm going to leave them lined. Eventually the silk lining will wear out. I mean, that's the benefit of lining, right? If you ever wonder why do we line garments and why do we line the high traffic areas of garments? That's because the lining takes the wear and tear of rubbing against your body, and then you can just replace the lining. If you don't line your garments, then the shell fabric, the visible fabric, will take the wear and tear from the inside, and it will wear away much more quickly than if it's only getting wear and tear from the outside. If it's getting wear and tear from direct wear and tear from both the inside and the outside, your fabric will wear away much more quickly, which is why I'm increasingly noticing that on the few extant gowns that we have from the continent in Europe from the 15th century, I'm noticing that, or from the descriptions of said gowns, that they are lined to about the hips, which makes sense because this area is the high traffic area. This is the most wear and tear from all the motion of your torso, from, being tight against your body. So that's why you will want to line it. Only necessary to go to the hips, because the rest of the skirts don't really see that much wear and tear until the very bottom. And that's why the technique seems to have been to do how am I going to do this? The technique seems to have been to therefore apply a facing. So yeah, that's probably a good reason for me to have lined this sleeve of the Burgundian gown in silk, because yes, the sleeve will certainly take wear and tear. If you see the linings, I should grab, maybe later, I'll grab one of my so-called Burgundian gowns, and I'll show you how the lining has gone. It's mostly gone at this point. It's literally in shreds. So that just shows you the importance of actually lining your sleeves and your bodice to protect them from you, in fact. Reptiles, lovely to see you. Have I ever played KCD? I have, yes. Well, let me put it this way. I haven't played the game, but I have gone through it with someone else who played the game, specifically to review the clothing. So if you're asking me about the clothing in Kingdom Come Deliverance, then yes, I have looked at it in depth. And in fact, I have 2 live streams discussing the clothing from Kingdom Come Deliverance and Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. You can watch the recordings on my YouTube channel. They're under the live tab, or if you just type in KCD or KCD2, you can bring up the live streams and you can see, I actually, with Philip from Irish Medieval History, we actually go through, in some cases, the game, but we just look at various stills from the game, and I show you how things should have looked. Yeah, I show you how things should have looked. So Kingdom Come Deliverance, the first one, wasn't super great in terms of clothing. It really wasn't. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is better, but it's still not perfect, and there's some really big errors. Like the silhouettes of all the men are very modern still. The men still all look basically like football players with a tunic on. And that's just not the 15th. That's not the bohemian silhouette of circa 1400. In that era, most men, especially fashionable men, had what's called a chalice silhouette. So their garments were designed to either reshape their body or to be padded so as to create a very specific shape that, unfortunately, by modern standards of masculinity, would be considered effeminate. And so instead of using the proper silhouette, every man in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 looks like he's a rugby player or an American football player with football player padded shoulders. And that's really distracting. So there's some good things about the update on Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and there's some, as they would say in German, some definite Verschlimmbesserungen. The women who are wandering around in just a freaking sleeveless kirtle or short sleeve kirtle like this with no smock covering their arms, no. And anyone who says, well, she's a prostitute, no. Prostitutes in medieval Europe, across medieval Europe, were actually regulated to wear more clothing than regular women, to designate them as such. They weren't just walking around with their boobs hanging out. Sorry. No, that's a modern idea of sex workers, not a medieval one. So yeah, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 gets it better than almost any Hollywood movie, basically, but it's still not perfect. There's still some issues there. Let's see. Have you seen the TV show Northmen? Oh yes, I love Northmen. Oh my God, Northmen is one of the best things on TV. I loved Northmen. I loved the way it mocked the TV show The Vikings, but also the way it mocked like corporate structures. Hysterical. I loved Northmen. So great. And the clothing in Northmen, unless they're intentionally mocking the bad clothing from from Vikings is just so much better. I love Northmen. It was hysterical. Fantastic series. Yep. Absolutely fantastic series. Okay, let me see if I missed something. Yeah, okay. Yeah, Northmen, I laughed. Oh gosh, I have to watch that again. I wonder if it's available on Netflix here in Korea. It's great. It's fun. It's good fun for the whole family. 100%. Yep. Okay, so what I'm doing now is I'm actually just doing whip stitches to whip stitch this into place. Just put that down there. I'm just doing whip stitches to whip this. Basically, I have already folded open the seam allowance and ironed it copiously with steam. You will definitely want to use steam when you are ironing wool because the animal proteins just respond so much better to hot steam than to dry heat. And then I've folded it open so that now all I have to do is go down and put whip stitches in, and I'm not even going to bother pinning it because it's so well ironed. Remember, the iron is your friend. Now, ironing in the 15th century is a bit, there's some question marks there. So we know we have depictions of actual irons from 15th century workshops. And so we know for a fact that they had been invented and were in use by then. How much were irons in use versus other methods like glass smoothers? Well, we do still find, I'll show you a glass smoother. We do still find depictions of these in tailor shops even up to the 16th century. This is a glass smoother. So, you know, the problem with an iron is that a medieval iron is literally just a piece of metal with a metal handle, and it's going to be very hard to control the heat. So on delicate fabrics especially, you would not have wanted to use a medieval iron. On super duper expensive silks, I'm going to bet they're not using irons. I think irons were probably reserved for wools and for linens or other less expensive plant fibers, like maybe hemp also, because those, especially linen, can take a high heat and not wind too much. Wool is fairly good at handling high heat. Silk, no, you don't want it. You do not want to ruin your beautiful, expensive silk. Yeah, by using an uncontrollably hot piece of metal. So for that, you have these glass smoothers, right? Basically, it's a giant blob of, it's a big blob of glass anyway, big, heavy blob of glass. What's interesting about the glass smoother is that you can polish your linen with these things. So you can actually, what it does is it actually compresses the linen and smooths it until you make it shine. And I have experimented with this and it absolutely 100% works. Linen is, in fact, there is this thing called a sleeky stone referenced in a 15th century English source, description of how to start your garments, actually refers to a sleeky stone. And a sleeky stone is basically not glass, but it's a stone, a giant flat stone that you would use to do the same thing to your fabric. And we know that they were reusing Neolithic axe heads for this purpose, because Neolithic axe heads are everywhere to be found all across Europe, honestly. But of course, they didn't know that they were Neolithic axe heads. They just knew that they were nice, smooth stones that were oblong and easy to handle. And so we know that up until the 19th century in Ireland, even, they were still using Neolithic axe heads to smooth fabric. How cool is that? So you can achieve this smoothing and polishing effect either with your Neolithic axe head of choice or with these blobs of glass. And it's possible that the blobs of glass I read one reference where it seemed that the glass was heated. No, and I haven't yet experimented with this. We talked about this at one of my recent sewing parties. I asked for everyone's thoughts on how to best heat this thing up without, causing it to shatter from thermal shock. And I think the winner is going to be putting it in a bowl of hot water, letting it heat up enough so that it's hot, it's warm, but it's not so hot that I can't handle it. And then using that to encourage the linen to give up its wrinkles better. Yeah. Is the shine on the silk permanent? Shine on silk? Oh, well, thank you, Mill Hunter. Appreciate. Oh, sorry. Yeah. T, welcome. Lovely to see you. Is the shine on the silk permanent? Are you talking about the linen? So the shine on silk is pretty permanent unless the silk gets really rough. That's just a natural inherent property of the silk fibers. The shine on, or unless it gets really coated in minerals, right? The shine on linen is not permanent. It will last a long time. And that's the other thing about polishing your linen with these glass polishers is that it makes your linen longer wearing because it compresses all of the fibers and which makes them tougher basically. It's like, denser. It makes the fibers, the threads denser basically, and it means there's fewer little fiber barbs sticking out, and so there's less surface area for wear and tear. So it makes your linen longer wearing, which would also be probably very key in the Middle Ages when they're looking for ways to extend the shelf life of everything, the useful life of everything. Right. So yeah, I'm pretty certain that the shine. I know for some people who have done this themselves and actually worn the polished linen garments, they say I've heard reports of multiple months of the sheen lasting for multiple months, even through washings. Interestingly, I was playing with some Michael Pretorius earlier. Ooh, many gavottes, brawls, and Renaissance dance music. Yeah, Michael Pretorius, one of our primary sources for 16th century dance music. Yeah, of course, Michael Pretorius's repertory is in this intersectional world where his music is still actually danceable. But by the time we get to the late 16th century, a lot of collections of music that present dance music are no longer danceable. It's actually reached the point where what was once considered dance music has petrified into chamber music and has now been rendered so complex with all sorts of divisions and complexity of notation that it's no longer danceable because it can't be played quickly enough to be danced anymore. John Dallin's Most of John Dallin's galliards, like 99% of them, are 1,000,000% undanceable. So that should tell you something about, but they're beautiful, but they're completely undanceable. Same thing with a lot of his pavans. They have to be played so slowly because of all of the complexity to get all of those little fiddly 32nd and 64th notes in that it's utterly undanceable. But that's kind of the point at which you realize that what was once a popular dance is probably no longer a popular dance. The music has clung on because the music can be modified to suit other tastes, but the dance has probably fallen out of favor. Let's see. Hot water or hot sand? Yeah, Villa Vendetta, 100%. If I had, for instance, if I had a sand, a the hot sand bed for making Turkish coffee, for instance, I could totally use that to heat this up. Yep, agreed. So let me see. I'm at the end of this stage of thread, so I'm just going to bury it. But yeah, the polishing of the linen with this sleeky stone, as it seems to have been called in 15th century English. I haven't had a chance to do like what I want to do is just sit down and just polish the linen for like 30 minutes and really give it a good shine and then show it to you and then experiment with how long it takes before the polish sort of wears off. Like I do pictures day by day so we can track the progress. I don't get the jewelry you're wearing. Does gold fit your attire? Thank you. That's a very good question. Appreciate that, reptiles. Yes. So I am wearing the underclothes of a noblewoman, right? I'm not a peasant. This is a noblewoman in her at home. Consider this the Lululemon of 15th century noblewomen's wardrobes, right? There's a fancier version of this kirtle that I could be wearing. Like this could be made out of silk damask, for instance, or cloth of gold, some kirtles were, or velvet, some kirtles were. And I do actually plan on making a couple of kirtles out of those different kinds of fabrics. But we do know that, even the Queen of France had kirtles made out of wool. So yeah, this is the Lululemon of the patrician 15th century patrician woman's closet, basically. So we're at home. I've invited you into my private apartments, and I am dressed casually with just a little bit of bling to indicate that I am definitely not a peasant. Yeah. So I'm wearing consider this casual, 15th century noblewoman casual. Yeah. Now, if your question is, would, say, a well-heeled peasant woman have had a piece of jewelry like this? She could have. By the 15th century, the distinctions between classes have been vanishing rapidly in the wake of the Black Death, and that's one of the reasons that there are statutes, pretty strong statutes, against, certain members of the merchant class or the working class wearing gold and jewelry, by which we know that members of the peasantry and the working class and even the servant class were wearing gold and jewelry. If they weren't, they wouldn't have to make laws against it. And we also know from court records that reflect the occasional enforcement of those sumptuary laws. Yeah. So I think, yeah. And this actually, thank you for bringing that up, reptiles. I really appreciate that, because that really segues nicely into this fantastic podcast to which I just listened on medievalist.net. And if you are not familiar with the page medievalist.net, please do check them out. The page is run by Dr. Danielle Sobalski, and she is a fantastic medievalist from Canada, I think. And her web, medievalist.net, is basically it's a news website for medieval history. And she has a podcast, and they have various guests on this podcast. And the latest one is about how the 90% in ancient Rome, what the economy was like for them, what daily life in the ancient Roman economy was like for the bottom 90% rather than the top 10%. And this presentation from Kim Bowes is the name of the historian who just wrote this really great book. I'm calling it great because just what I heard from the podcast makes me think it's going to be a great book. She wrote this great book about how with completely new ideas about how the bottom 90% of the Roman economy actually experienced life. What kinds of things did they own? What kinds of things did they eat? How much money did they have at their disposal? And she has completely re-examined the actual she's an archaeologist, the actual archaeological evidence and the documentary evidence, because we have these papyri rolls that have survived from Egypt, for instance, from this era, that go into deep detail about people's purchases across all the strata of society. So Roman Egypt, right? And so she is completely turning the old model of subsistence economy on its head, and she's completely questioning whether we should even use the word peasant anymore. And her very well-reasoned solution is no, we shouldn't, because the term peasant conjures some very specific misconceptions in most people's minds, because we think a peasant is a peasant. So a peasant in the Roman world is a peasant, in the Carolingian world is a peasant, in the Ancien regime is a peasant in late 19th century Russia, right? And just none of that is true. And as she points out, it's a useless class. Using this word peasant it's a useless way of classifying people based on misconceptions. So yeah, the things she was talking about are really revolutionary. She talked about how when, there's this, one of the ways in which economies are judged in the archaeological record is skeletal remains, right? How big are the skeletons? How tall are they? How robust are they? What kind of deficiencies do they have, or deficiencies do they have or not have? And so there's this, I remember reading this myself in multiple places. Well, after the fall of the Roman Empire, skeletons start getting bigger, which means that the economy must be better for the average person. And therefore, this is how we can tell that people were really poor in the Roman Empire versus what came after it or later on. And as she pointed out, that's just not true. There are other factors that are going to determine how tall skeletons are. There's genetic factors, but also it's not necessarily whether you have a lot of calories or a few calories. The kind of calories matter. So your general dietary practices or cultural dietary practices play big time into that. As I've noted, living here in Eastern Asia, it's not genetics that make people small. It isn't. It's absolutely not. You know how I know that? Because people who are my age and younger here are super tall. Koreans are NBA player height, a lot of them, towering over everyone else, men and women, by the way. And I can tell which ones got meat. It's about the meat. It's not about the calories. It's about the meat. I can tell which ones had appropriate amounts of protein, dense and bioavailable protein in the crucial formative growing years, right? And that is what is changing. It's not a question of it was famine before and it's feast now. It's a question of it was a lot of rice and vegetables before in those formative years, and tofu is just not enough. I'm sorry. But these people have now been growing up. They've grown up on a lot of meat, a lot more meat. And so now they're reaching their genetic destiny, right? So there's, the Roman Empire was heavily grain-based. Like its diet was very grain-based. Yes, they had fish and meat, but if you look at what the average person was eating, it was a lot of grain. Grain is not going to help you grow tall. Protein is. So yeah, but that doesn't mean that people were poor or malnourished or starving. Well, malnourished maybe a little bit on the macro level. So yeah, this new book that she's putting out looks really interesting, and I can highly recommend listening to the podcast. She's an excellent presenter, very energetic, very engaged, very charismatic, I guess, kind of like me, some of you might say, and very knowledgeable. And she points to parallels between empires, right? How empires are founded on consumerism, and the Roman Empire, despite being a pre-industrial society by modern ideas of industrialization, even though it's definitely industrial, still was a consumer society, massive consumption. So yeah, there's a lot of really deep thinking to be done in listening to her podcast. Let me see. Oh, Dana, thank you. Thank you for joining. Thank you for joining. Dana, if you have any questions, you're still there. If you have any questions after you watch it, pop them in the comments and I will answer, I promise. Let me see. I've read there was a huge jump in height from cow's milk drinking in the 50s with America influences, apparently. Yeah, also calcium, lots of calcium. Good point. Good point, Villa Vendetta. A lot more access to bioavailable calcium, right? There are sea vegetables that do have calcium, but not enough. And we're not necessarily eating enough of the calcium that you can get in, say, seaweed and sea algae, right? So yeah, also that. Although the Roman Empire did have cheese, but not necessarily enough. So yeah. Oh, Marduk, you poor baby. Goodbye. Yep. You are gone. Okay. Oh, poor little incel, intimidated by an intelligent, charismatic woman. Oh, goodbye. Okay. Let me just check and make sure I didn't miss any of the comments. Is the bottom stone black tourmaline? Oh, you're talking about this? No, these are both glass. Neither of these are jewels. Neither of these are gems, but that's supposed to look like a sapphire. It's blue. Let's see. Could I get a Cleveland steamer? Okay. In Japan, people don't fit in houses anymore. Yeah, Japan's the same way. And you can see the intergenerational differences between, you can tell in Korea, there's a difference from north to south, right? So there is, if you go up to Seoul, you can tell that the growth started much earlier there than it started here in Daegu, for instance. So in Daegu, the average height of people is still pretty small, even amongst the younger generations. But in Seoul, starting in people who are now in their 50s or even 60s in some cases, the heights already have started getting taller. And yeah, like there's a lot of the traditional house, God knows, the traditional houses, especially the hanok, the older hanok from like 100 years ago. No, modern Koreans are definitely having problems fitting in those, which is why a lot of them, if they're still around, they're being turned into vacation rentals so that people can experience the traditional old-fashioned way of life for like a weekend and then go back to their modernly heighted apartments. Thank you. I have very, very kind of you to say. This is 15th century Franco-Burgundian, basically. So think England, France, the Netherlands for the most part. Yeah. Let me see. The Japanese houses were small even then as it helped keep it warm. Less space to heat. Yeah, I mean, that's also depending, and you can tell the difference in the class of a home here in Korea based on how big the spaces are, not just because of, more space equals more money to buy space because of the cost of heating. Yeah, 100%. Same thing here in Korea. Yeah, the similarities between Korea and Japan are often remarkable, and also then if you think about it, maybe not remarkable. Like no one should be surprised considering not only how close they are, but some cultural influences. Yeah. Okay. So what else is everyone working on today? Let me see. There were some other fun things I recently read. Oh, I have just procured recently from Christine de Pizan, The Treasure of the City of Ladies. This is going to be coming to Medieval Storytime. And some of the very interesting things in there are sections on advice on how noble women should behave. And it's very interesting because unfortunately, it seems like not much has changed. It's reading her advice was like reading advice on any website, on any Facebook group aimed at women, advice for women on how to survive in a world with men, basically. And even though at the time the so-called social media network was analog, it still addresses the issue of reputation and how reputation can be destroyed. And so, yeah, it's very interesting. We're going to be reading some of those passages in Medieval Storytime. So if you would like to, I'll be scheduling that for sometime this week. I have to look at my calendar and see what's on my schedule. But yeah, I'll be scheduling a Medieval Storytime, and we will be reading Christine de Pizan's The Treasure of the City of Ladies. And I will try to start that earlier. Sorry, I forgot that today I had a morning meeting. And so even though I scheduled this to start at half an hour before it did, I forgot that I had scheduled it to start earlier. So I will try to start it earlier for those of you, especially on the East Coast. Yeah, Christine de Pizan, The Treasure of the City of Ladies, highly recommended. This ensemble would be recognizable and no one would look askance at it from the 1410s up until probably the 1570s. And then in the 1580s, something different kind of happens with the kirtle. The short sleeve kirtle is still there, but it's now got this big open V in the front with a stomacher underneath of it, or possibly an entire bodice, depending on your interpretation of the art. So yeah, it dates to 1410s to about the 1470s, more or less. This style of kerchief, as it was called in 15th century English, seems to make an appearance in the 1450s, but it stays in use for well into the 16th century in basically this shape. So yeah, what year do I particularly these days mostly focus on the 1470s and 1480s, but as a lover of fashion history across the world and across time, I definitely cover a wide array of eras. Yeah. So let's talk about seam allowances. Now, in the extant garments we have, for the most part, we see tiny, tiny seam allowances. But increasingly, as we're finding more garments that are actually fitted, like this one, the fitted garments, what we're finding is that there seems to be more generous seam allowances. And this makes a lot of sense because for men and women, the size of your body is going to change over the years and or decades. And these garments, even amongst the aristocracy, are intended to be worn across the decades, not just for a year or two, but possibly for a whole decade or more. And so it's acknowledged that in the case of women, there probably might be pregnancies or not, depending on the year. And so your garment may need to be adjusted. You might need to let some seam allowance out or take some seam allowance in. In the case of men, your shape is definitely going to change as you age because you're going to bulk out, and then you might bulk out. And so what we're seeing is that it seems that in the more voluminous overgarments, seam allowances are tiny. And we can see that, for instance, in the grave finds of the Hupeland from Prague Castle from like about 1400, where the seam allowances are absolutely minuscule. But that's a voluminous garment. You don't need to let that's a more or less a one size fits most kind of garment. So you don't need to let seam allowances out or in as the body shape changes. Whereas for doublets, pourpoints, farsetti, all of these the different words for these fitted garments for men, all the extant ones I've examined now have pretty decent seam allowances in the side and possibly the back. And the same thing for the very few fitted extant women's garments from the 15th century. I'm thinking of Beata or Osana Andreazzi's Gamora. There is actually quite a bit of seam allowance on the sides and the back. And it was always assumed that was because she was a 13-year-old when the dress was made for her. And the assumption was that she would be wearing it for years. And so they needed to make it so that it could expand to fit her growing adolescent body. Of course, as it turns out, they didn't need to do that because she joined a convent and never wore that dress again, as far as we can tell. Yeah. So it never needed to be let out. The seams were never let out. The seams remain the prepubescent or pubescent, early pubescent Beata, not Beata, Osana, the pubescent Osana's measurements. So I do have actually some decent seam allowances here in the sleeve, and that's okay because if my arms get more muscular through exercise, then I will be able to let the sleeve out as necessary. It could happen. Okay, let me see. Who did the house accounting in the Middle Ages? Oh, okay. So household accounting was usually managed. So the accounting itself was usually kept by your steward, your household steward. But in the instructions on how to live a successful life as an adult noblewoman, one of the sections in here actually says right here, Rule 18 for ladies, Rule 7. The seventh rule, or the seventh teaching, describes how the wise princess will keep a careful eye on her revenues and finances and on the state of her court. So even though it's your steward, the household steward, who is keeping the books generally and overseeing your purchases, and depending on the complexity of your household, you might have a wardrobe, and a wardrobe will, for instance, monitor the costs involved in your clothing, and then the steward might then kind of compile all of those expenses into your general accounts, right? But generally you have a steward who oversees your expense accounts, your accounts. But it's very clear that it was expected that at the very least the lady of the house should audit the financial records, and probably the lord as well. Yeah. So that is just the that's how it was. So it depends on the size of your house. The answer is it depends on the size of your house. In Italy, very often it was the master of the house might actually technically keep the books, so to say, or track all the expenses. But when he was gone, which was frequent, then the lady of the house would step in, or it might have been a joint venture. In very large courts, like royal courts, royal households had very complex administrative tools. That's not the word I'm looking for. Organs. They had very large administrative organs. So you would have an entire department, multiple departments headed by officers. And each department would probably track their own expenses. And then that would get consolidated in, the overall expenses for the entire household. So it depends on your household, but there was generally, at the lower levels, say at the individual craftsman level, it was either the lady or the man of the house who is keeping track. And we see examples of both. The higher you go, the higher you go up the socioeconomic ladder, the more involved and complex your household and your household structures, the more likely you are to have a finance department. Yeah, so not just the wife, not just the wife. Could be the wife, could be the Lord, could be the husband. You could have a steward who oversees it, but or who actually does the actual accounting work, but it's the lady of the house doing the auditing, right? Depends on the household. Let me see. How do they wash their garments? Not too often. Okay, so very good question. Thank you, Felicia. So the different kinds of garments were laundered in different ways. This linen underlayer that you see here, this is called a smocca in 15th century English. It was called a camicia in 15th century Italian. It was called a camisa in various forms in various 15th century Spanish language, Iberian languages, a chemise in French, right? This is the layer that gets laundered regularly, probably once a week, if not more. This is the layer that gets laundered regularly. And it would be boiled. It would be soap would be used, fermented urine would be used, i.e. ammonia, to bleach it. It would be laid out on bleaching greens. The sunlight would bleach it from above. The oxygen being off-put from the grass from below would combine to help bleach these garments out, right, regularly, very regularly. We have laundry bills. Laundry bills are one of the most common expenses in household expense accounts, honestly. And they talk about large quantities of clothing being laundered, but that's only the white linen layer. So like the kerchiefs, veils, those kinds of things that are white and that can be subjected to that harsh laundry process. They're laundered on a very regular basis. So this idea, again, and across all levels of society, not just the upper levels of society, right? The medieval household in and of itself, the medieval noble household in and of itself was a complex beast featuring, in some cases, thousands of people in the case of Burgundy, right? If you talk about all the officers and the servants, and all of them were expected to be clean and sweet smelling. Even the lowest servants were expected to be clean and sweet smelling and to wear nice clothes, which were provided to them. Right. So not only would they have laundered their clothing on a regular basis, they would have washed their bodies in some way on a very, very regular basis. So I just want to put that out there. Medieval people were not dirty. They were not stinky as a general rule. They might, if they're in the middle of working, not be the cleanest, but they will then clean themselves once they're done with work. All you need is a bowl and a washcloth. So same thing with the clothes. Clothes were laundered, we suspect, about once a week, which does not mean that you would wear the same smock for 7 days. They had multiple smocks, even in the worker class, the labor class, the artisan class. They still would have a couple of smocks and they would wash them regularly. Yeah. Let me see. So yeah, but the overlayers, so like this wool, it would not be washed very often. It would be laundered as needed, and the process of laundering it would be mostly stain treatment. The thing about the linen being against your skin is it protects your overgarments from you, from the fetid conditions of your skin. And so that means that the wool layers wouldn't need care that often. They would be aired out on a fairly regular basis, like literally hung out the windows. And we know that this was done because the Ménagier de Paris, written in 1391, this fantastic middle-class book of household management, right? The medieval home companion, as one version refers to it, talks about not only airing out bedclothes on a regular basis by hanging them out the windows, but airing out clothing as well. Once a week, you should air out all of your clothes. Once a week, all your clothes, not just the clothes you're wearing, all your clothes should be aired out once a week. So, that was one way to keep them smelling fresh. And then you had tons of stain treatment options. So if you got stains on your overgarments, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of recipes, medieval recipes for stain treatments. Kind of like now, if you Googled natural stain remover for linen and you get 100 different suggestions, same idea in the Middle Ages. Kind of everyone had their own little best kept secrets for daily household functions such as stain removal. And many of these have survived. We have entire manuals that go into the depth of providing detailed instructions for how to make a stain treatment for wine, or a stain treatment for grease, or a stain treatment for urine, or a stain treatment for feces. And blood. Blood is one of the more common stain treatments that is mentioned in all the sources I've read. So the overgarments would not be wet washed. They would be dry cleaned. They would be dry cleaned and possibly wet spot treated, but not, as far as we can tell, you would not submerge silk or wool overgarments in medieval laundry practice. They had dry cleaning methods, basically. You look like you churn butter. I have churned butter, but that's not, I know this, you might think Dutch milkmaid, and that's because this medieval style of kerchief actually originates in what is now the Netherlands and France and Belgium, right? But at the time, this was not a dairy maid outfit. This is my casual medieval noblewoman at home outfit. Very cool stuff as a history nerd. Well, thank you, Carrot. Appreciate that. Did love matter in medieval weddings? Not really. So love did not matter in medieval weddings. Not really. Not like we think of it. The primary function of a medieval marriage, and you're not talking about weddings, you mean the marriage. The primary function of marriage in the pre-modern world, and even in most places still in the world in which we inhabit today, outside of America and Europe, the primary consideration is socioeconomic and or dynastic, depending on your level of the strata. Now, what did matter to the medieval church in Europe was consent, right? There was a very hard and fast rule that you had to have the consent of both parties. They had to consent. Now, that just means they had to say, I will, in the vows. That doesn't mean that they couldn't be coerced into consenting, men and women. But the most important factor was either dynastic and or socioeconomic. Love didn't matter. Not in the least. There are a handful of true love matches that are true love matches, as in dynamic considerations were not taken into account at all. And they're remarkable because literally they're so rare that you remark upon them. One of them is actually a famous one, Edward IV of England with Elizabeth Woodville, right? Edward IV of England, he's this young, hot knight who finds himself on the English throne in the midst of the Cousins War, and he's got it all, right? He's the king of England now. He's really puissant, he's sexy, he's attractive, he's erudite, he's polished and educated, and the Earl of Warwick sets up goes to the trouble of trying to arrange a match with one of the French princesses to create this powerful dynastic bond between England and France and hopefully secure peace, yada, yada, yada. And what does he do? He spots Elizabeth Woodville, falls in lust with her, and don't tell me it's love because it happened way too quickly for that, falls in lust with her, and they get married. And so that was 100% a so-called love match because there was zero benefit for him dynastically speaking, zero political benefit, right? None, just none. Yeah, let me see. Oh, guys, I have to go OT with Tasha. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Well, sleep well. What got me originally fascinated in medieval times? I have been fascinated by the so-called olden days since I can remember, since the time I was a teeny tiny little girl. I realized I had a recent realization, though, in a memory from my childhood travels up to Cape Cod and specifically to Plymouth Plantation. Plymouth Plantation is a living history center where they have rebuilt the original Plymouth colony homestead, the first plantation, as it were, of the Puritans who arrived on the Mayflower. And I visited that when I was 5. And the people there live the summer there like it's the 17th century, like it's the 1620s. They wear the clothes, they cook the food, they do the farming and all the things, right? They build buildings. Everything that was done in the 1620s, they are doing there. And I was fascinated by that, absolutely fascinated to see people living like the olden days. And so I'm pretty certain that gave me my love of historical material culture and wondering about how people lived back then. The medieval part, I think, is because probably, one, I was exposed to a lot of 15th century art, going to the National Gallery in Washington and the Walters Gallery and the Philadelphia Museum of Art and the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Met's cloisters, right? So I was just kind of inundated. I was marinated in medieval aesthetics growing up because of my parents and who they were. And then I think reading medieval literature, and especially the courtly literature, made me long for a world, even if it was only artificial and only existed in very specific moments, a courtly world in which there's this beautiful, very ritualized interaction, fin amour, as it's called, right? But there's the dancing and the pageantry of the medieval court just particularly appeals to me. So yeah, I think so. Let me see. Villa Vendetta says there's a sweet spot where your not so rich marriage is a power move and not too poor marriage is a life raft from poverty, but likely to be able to marry for love, or maybe unlikely. Yeah, agree with you, Villa, 100%. Yep. So it's marriage was definitely much more about the socioeconomics than about the emotions. Now, what did often happen, and more often than most people realize, is that even in an arranged marriage, it is absolutely possible to develop respect, mutual respect, and even affection that would absolutely develop into what we call romantic love. That did happen a lot, but it just didn't matter if it did. That didn't matter. What mattered was producing children. What mattered was the socioeconomic benefits for both parties. What mattered was the dynastic benefit for both parties, depending on your level in society. That's what mattered. It mattered. That's what really ultimately became the main concern when it came to arranging these marriages. But that being said, there's plenty of evidence that these matches turned into very affectionate relationships. And we can tell that because we have correspondence that has survived. We can tell that based on the way that funerary memorials are set up and explicitly designed to depict a love connection between the husband and the wife. We have effigies where they're holding hands, right? Where the husband and wife on the effigies, the statuary on their graves, they've been carved. They intentionally commissioned their funeral effigies to depict them holding hands. If that's not a sign of affection, I don't know what is. Now, granted, I've recently heard some debate that could be some kind of stylistic thing that doesn't actually say anything about their affection, but until I see more solid evidence that it wasn't about affection, I'm going to go with husband and wife holding hands in death as a sign of affection. Just saying. So yeah, love in pre-modern times is a very interesting subject. Marriage, and the concept of marriage and whether it should have affection as an integral part of it is, that's definitely a more modern interpretation, 100%. Yeah. So let's see. I'm trying to think of other examples of love. Oh, I recently read there is Dere Amore, which is a book that was written by Andreas Capellanus, Andrew the Chaplain, supposedly, with the rules of fin amour, courtly love. And some people have said, well, the rules courtly love was not something that was real. It was just a literary construct. And Andrew Capellanus was writing to tell you what not to do. It was a farcical composition, except that the person for whom it was composed was deep in the culture of courtly love of the 12th century. And we know from chronicles of the era, not just literature, but actual chronicles, that of various royal courts, that they engaged in these ritualized games of love, of fin amour. So courtly love was absolutely not just courtly love as we call it now, but it was called fine love, refined love. Like this ritualized love, this ritualized romantic relationships seem to have been something that was actively engaged in real time. And for certain, there were plenty of affairs happening between ladies and knights and lords and ladies of variously in unequal levels. I've read a plethora of court cases where this happens all the time. So I absolutely debate I would argue against anyone who says that so-called courtly love was just a literary trope. Yeah, definitely, I do not think that is true. Why am I not addressing people in the comments? I am. I've answered everyone's questions. Lalit, did I miss a comment? I've said goodbye and hello to everyone. So yeah, all the questions that have been asked, I have addressed. So if you have a question or a comment, go ahead and pop it in. I'm literally right now, I'm talking about love and marriage, and that was in direct response to a question in the comments. So I don't know what you're exactly about what you are bemoaning, Lalit. Yeah, if you asked a question and I missed it, go ahead and pop it in. I should tell you that there is sometimes a lag. There is often, oh yeah, you all need to know, there is often a lag between the time that you make a comment in the live chat and the time I see the comment in the live chat. Yep. Mistress V, what was the name of that author, milady? Oh, Andreas Kapellanis, Andrew the Chaplain. If you look up Andrew the Chaplain and the Rules of Courtly Love, feel free to look through it. Now, some people say there are 3 books. And there are 3 books. The first 2 books are about the rules of courtly love. And then the 3rd book is this book that basically says, oh, but just kidding. You shouldn't do any of that. That's nonsense. I suspect the 3rd book was added later on. I think the 3rd book was added as a way to moralize the first 2 books and dissuade people from engaging in such relationships. This is definitely a real video. I am a real person. I am not AI. There is no filters here. No filters, no nothing. This is a real backdrop. Look, it's actually a tapestry, right? So yeah, it is a wall hanging. It is a tapestry weave, even though the pattern has been silk screened, but the weave is actually a tapestry weave. So no, this is a real video. Welcome to the 15th century, my friend. Welcome to my medieval sewing party. And I guess this is a good time, if you're enjoying this, please like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. I have to remind everyone again that YouTube regularly resets your notification settings. So you might want to check that you have chosen the right settings and that they are still actually, in fact, active and enabled, because often YouTube will reset it to having the algorithm tell you when you want to watch something versus, say, being informed of all of the notifications when I go live, for instance. Courtly love was about finding someone you chose for yourself, because in arranged marriages for political reasons, love wasn't of primary importance. Yeah, 100%. Love was not even of any importance, not even just not primary importance. Love was not a consideration. Now, what was a consideration, and again, we know this from letters, that correspondence that survives. For instance, in Florence in the 15th century, many of you have heard me talk about Alessandra Strozzi. She composed hundreds of letters to her sons who were in exile in Rome and Naples. And she asks them for things on a regular basis, but she also discusses a lot of matters that are important to a upper class family in Florence. One of them is marriage arrangements for the daughters of the family, one of whom, by the way, is the natural daughter of her husband, i.e. her husband's bastard with a mistress, possibly a slave even. And the other is for her daughter. And in both cases, when she's talking to her sons about the options, one of her primary concerns is that the daughters will be well cared for. So it's not that was, I think that modernly we want to automatically decry arranged marriages as barbaric and unenlightened. But I would like to point out that in correspondence we have that talks about arranged marriages, especially in Florence, there is definitely a concern expressed and anxiety expressed about how well will this family care for our little girl. So it's not necessarily about, it's not about the groom, it's about the whole family. How will the whole family treat our daughter when she is incorporated into this new family? So that was a consideration, and it was a primary one often. Not necessarily so much a primary consideration at the top levels, but even in the arranged marriages of, say, princesses of England, we actually do see in correspondence that is a concern. Edward III was very anxious that his lovely Joan should be taken care of in her new family as she's being sent to Portugal for this arranged marriage. Unfortunately, she dies of the plague on the way on a ship outside of Bordeaux, so she doesn't make it. But even at that level, we can see the king and the queen caring whether their princess, whether their daughter is going to be treated with respect, whether she will become comfortable, whether her life will be good in this new place. On the other hand, Fernando of Aragon, Ferdinand and Isabella, one of the two Catholic monarchs, didn't seem to give a shit about Catherine of Aragon. He abandoned her, right? Once she married into the English family, he literally abandoned her financially, and she lived in penury for years because he was such an asshole and he didn't care. So your results may vary, but there does definitely seem to often be concern about the outcomes for the children, for the daughters especially. Oh my gosh, let's go love yourself. I'm so sorry to hear that. The last live video was a dude pretending to sleep and reacting to a fart sound. The live video before that was a goth girl and boys standing on a ladder and acting wild. Now I'm on a fun history video. Well, welcome to my community. Welcome to my community. Let's go love yourself. I'm the creative Contessa, and you're in my medieval sewing party, where I work on hand sewing projects, or medieval crafting and sewing projects, and answer questions that people have about medieval material culture based on my research and knowledge. I'm big into primary source research. I read a lot of chronicles. I read a lot of expense accounts. I read wills. I read letters and correspondence, all of the sources that help archaeological reports, so that I can get as well-informed an idea of life in the past. So if you have any questions about medieval life, just let me know. Stephanie, so good to see you, my dearest Isabeau. Let me see. I'm a white guy, but your pre-trial of history doesn't speak well of white guys. My pre-trial of history? I don't know. I think that there is not much difference necessarily, and it's not about skin color, it's about your culture. And there's a lot of different ways in which marriages are arranged across different societies and cultures. In Joseon, so there's a big shift in Korea in the first millennium across Korea, and up until about 1400 in Korea, women and men are generally treated equally. They have equal rights before the law. They can consent or decide their own marriages or not. And one of the ways you can tell that it's a society that values women is that up until the very end of the Goryeo dynasty, when a man and a woman got married, the man went to live with her and her family. But then starting in the Joseon dynasty, that changed. The woman went to live with the husband and his family. And so she became an interloper and a bottom class citizen in the household. Whereas in the Goryeo dynasty, it wasn't the case at all. The brides retained power, they had legal rights, they could own property, they were educated, right? And then that shifts in the Joseon dynasty. So the equality of marriage goes from being very equal and a woman retaining her rights as a human being to woman completely losing her rights, which is to say, in the Joseon dynasty, I wouldn't want to get married. I'd rather be a giseng, 100%. Screw marriage. You are a bottom class citizen as a wife in the Joseon dynasty. Your mother-in-law has all the power. Your husband has all the power. You are nothing. And you might even get deposed by a concubine if you can't successfully produce a male heir, right? So you don't have anything then. You are less than nothing then. You're worthless. Yeah, definitely giseng life for me. Thank you. Question, what medieval food will you be cooking next? Yes, that is a very good question. I have been pondering that. So many of you know I do a medieval cooking party. So if you're interested in seeing medieval food prepared from an original medieval recipe while we experiment with the recipe and come up with a way to make turn this medieval text into something actually edible and preparable in a modern kitchen, make sure that you hit all notifications and watch my medieval cooking party live stream. Um, I have a whole bunch of almond milk from the last live stream. And so I was thinking of experimenting with you all on making the almond butter that is described in multiple recipes, the almond butter and the almond cheese that is described in multiple recipes. And then I was thinking of combining that with making a pie that would be the Lenten version of the many pies that are mentioned that involve cheese, but then during Lent, you're not supposed to eat cheese, or during Ember days, you're not supposed to eat dairy products because they're animal products. And instead, those recipes often say, make the appropriate substitutions. So I was thinking of doing basically an egg and cheese pie, but using the fresh cheese that is the almond butter and seeing how it turns out. That was a thought I had. Yeah, vegetarian dishes. See, Laurie, isn't that really funny? That's where I was going to go anyway, because I was absolutely leaning towards egg and cheese pies, which I love. I love egg and cheese pies. Love them. One of the things I love about medieval egg and cheese pies is that they're so shelf stable that you can bake them in advance and you can freeze them and they come out just fine texture wise. So for medieval event food, they're really fantastic and they don't need to be heated up to be tasty. And you don't even need to worry about them spoiling if your cooler is not quite perfect, especially if it's just a day you're out. You're not going to get bacterial growth basically on these things. So yeah, we're definitely going to be looking at some egg. Did I say meat and cheese pies? I meant egg and cheese pies. If I said meat and cheese, that's not me. I meant egg and cheese pies. Yeah, so we're definitely going to be looking at some egg and cheese pies. No, Laurie, it's fine. Is there something about the 1500s that you connect with, related to, or after learning? So 1400s. So 15th century is the 1400s. I do not like the 1500s. The 1500s sucks in Europe. It's a terrible time in Europe. It's the Reformation. It's wars of religion. Women are losing all kinds of status and power thanks to the Reformation. Poverty is being moralized. It is the rise of the broken modern world, basically. So I do not like the 16th century. But the 15th century, I connect especially with the material culture in terms of the beauty of the dances and the music that are enjoyed, the ritualized interactions within the courts at various levels, whether it's a committal court or a ducal court or a royal court. The clothing really appeals to me. I really love the clothing from the 15th century, and the aesthetic, the interior decor aesthetics really appeal to me a lot. If I had the money, I would literally just make the interior of my entire house look like 15th century home, but very upper class 15th century home with all the bells and whistles. Yeah, no, let's go love yourself. No, please. I hope I wasn't too harsh. But the 16th century sucks. I will die on that hill. The 16th century sucks. The music, I mean, I like the music still, but it's not as zesty and interesting. The 15th century is kind of the last time that music is zesty and interesting until dance music. I'm talking about dance music. That dance music is zesty and interesting until the early 19th century with the rise of jazz. After that, dance music is just kind of, it's all even amounts of bars and even amounts of measures, 4, 4, 4, 4, the 4/4 revolution of the 17th century Germans, right? Whereas before that, you've got music that has tempo changes and what we would consider uneven phrases, so 3.5 bars, lots of half-bar phrases, and it's not just the same thing over and over and over and over on repeat, right? There's not the verse and refrain style music rises, as far as we can tell, in the 15th century, but there's still not much of it. It's in the 16th century when music shifts almost entirely to verse and refrain style music. So yeah, there's a lot of different things. The food is also delicious. 15th century food, oh, so yummy. So complex, so many fantastic flavors, sweet and savory and sour, spices, lots of spices to give depth to your dishes, and not all the same spices all the time. So it's definitely just not a question of more of the same. All these different fun ways to prepare things to make them look like things they're not. It's just there's a lot of things I love about the 15th century. Ashley, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Great lead in. What are the fungal dishes that lead people, the fungal dishes that lead people out of the Dark Ages? Reptiles? Fungal dishes. If you could you clarify fungal for me? Are you actually talking about mushrooms? Uh, the music is so challenging in the 15th century, 16th is much easier. I agree. Yeah, 100%. You get it's just, and the dances also start following these very rote, repetitive patterns that are extremely predictable, right? In the 15th century, the dances are not like that at all. Did medieval commoners eat mushrooms? Okay, yes. Mushrooms. Mushrooms are an interesting topic. Yes, mushrooms are definitely mentioned, although not so mushrooms. We have a couple of dishes, a couple of pies with mushrooms for the most part. Mushrooms do not feature very prominently in medieval cookbooks, but the medieval cookbooks that have survived are, of course, generally aimed at the well-heeled members of society, whether it's the mercantile patricians or the royal or the noble courts. So my thought, now this is me thinking aloud because I actually haven't pondered this until now, so great question, reptiles. My thought is that probably mushrooms being something that was forageable and easily forageable by anyone, and people would have known which ones were toxic and which ones weren't, that they weren't necessarily considered the primary, a luxury item worthy of inclusion in these cookbooks necessarily. So I can think of one mushroom pie recipe offhand, and I can't think of any other recipes offhand where mushrooms are included in the list of ingredients. But I think that's because it might have been considered a lower class foodstuff. They also would have been only available at certain times in certain seasons. And I have not read or learned about mushroom farming or heard about mushroom farming, mushroom cultivation, for instance, in the medieval world. So it could be that it just wasn't considered worthy of inclusion in the cookbooks of the elite, so to say. And it was considered something that could just be found when it was available and included in a pottage. But there is one recipe for a mushroom and cheese pie that is indeed super yummy. Oh God. Subtleties. Yes, subtleties are so yummy. What is a medieval time? Um, okay, wait. Bunch of comments just came in. Oh goodness. Okay. So first off, the Middle Ages is literally called that because it is the age, the era that is in the middle of the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of the modern world. Some people would say the Renaissance, some people would say the Enlightenment, depends on how you count medieval. So medieval is the Latin for Middle Ages, or Middle Age, for the age between those two. Medi, half, between, eval, age, right? So, okay, well, that's the French, but it comes from the Latin anyway. So, yeah, so it is the era between those two times. So, what counts as the Middle Ages is in high debate. A lot of modern historians are trying to move away from that terminology because it can be prejudicial and it makes people think like there's one era and it's all the same for 1,000 years. And that's just so not true. As of the Middle Ages, the era between the so-called fall of the Western Roman Empire and the so-called rise of the modern world is filled with growth and evolution and development on every level, on every metric, religious included, right? The church is not a monolith in the Middle Ages either. So, it's a modern moniker, it's a modern label that we use for convenience and also because it's now a buzzword on social media, but it doesn't actually tell you very much because well, what is the defining feature of the Middle Ages? Well, some people say feudalism, except that feudalism doesn't exist everywhere in medieval Europe, nor does it exist through the entirety of the medieval period across medieval Europe. So it can't be feudalism. That can't be the defining feature. Okay, knights. Knights don't exist across the entirety of medieval Europe, across the entirety of the medieval period. So, trying to find, okay, then you can say the church. Okay, well, that could be true that you have, what's now the Catholic Church as the church that governs more or less everyone's existence in some way or impacts everyone's existence in some way in the Middle Ages. Okay, I could maybe go for that, except then you've got the various heresies and the Crusades, and even then the church is not a monolith in and of itself. So, what defines the medieval world? Good luck trying to find that one thing that is actually true everywhere in medieval Europe. So that's why I start focusing on centuries and specific geographies. So I focus very hard on the 15th century. I have studied other periods, however, in depth. I started with my interest in medieval living history in the 12th century. And then I discovered that there were no dances that we know anything about in the 12th century. So I migrated forward to the 15th century because that was the earliest time for which we have documentable dance. There it is. But also, I do love a lot of things about 15th century culture as well. Let me see. Did medieval commoners eat mushrooms? Quite likely. I'm going to assume because they could be foraged, right? Mushrooms can be easily foraged. So 100% commoners would have eaten mushrooms. What was the most consumed meat of that age? Ooh, that's a hard question. So probably the most consumed meat seems to be pork. Pork and chicken seem to be the most consumed. But we records can be misleading because, what's the most common thing at a feast? Well, it depends on where you are, where the most common meat is going to be, right? Like if you're in a sheep-rich economy, then it could be that mutton ends up being your most common meat. If you're in a cow-rich economy, then it could be that beef ends up being your kind of meat. If there's a lot of game, then maybe you end up doing a lot of hunting on your preserve, and that ends up being the most common meat. That's probably unlikely though, because in many places in medieval Europe, hunting preserves were the preserve of the aristocrats and usually the king specifically. So I would say probably chicken is actually the most common meat across all levels of society, followed by pig. Cows, beef was a luxury that was not available very often, and mutton maybe was probably available more often than beef, actually. But you can't really, you have to look at archaeological record, the archaeology, like the bones that we find of animals. You have to look at expense accounts. You have to look at chronicles to really get a better idea about that, because the records of these cookbooks that we have are aimed at the elite. And so they're not going to present necessarily what the most common meats are for everyone. They're going to present what the most common meats or fish were for the elite, which is clearly not the majority of society. I would say probably chicken is the most common, followed by pork, followed by pig, because a pig will give you a lot of meat. And so you can preserve it, right? Meat was often salted. It was literally packed into barrels of salt so that you could then pull out pieces as you needed it. And chickens, they grow really quickly, they reproduce quickly. So yeah, chicken probably would have been pretty common. Fish was very, very popular in the medieval world. People had fish farms. Fish farms start in at least the Etruscan era, as far as we can tell, but probably further back than that. So fish farms were absolutely a thing in the Middle Ages. Fish ponds for having farmed fish, not a new concept. And of course, you had rivers, even inland, you had rivers and lakes and ponds that could have been publicly accessible. And so fish was definitely very common. The kind of fish, that was most common would vary based on your region. I'm not necessarily an expert on fish because I generally don't care for most fish. So I don't recreate fish in my medieval cuisine. Eel was the most popular fish. 100%. It was eel. Eel was the most popular. Whether or not you could afford it, that was a different question, but did everyone want it? Yes. So I guess it's a difference. There's a difference necessarily in popular in the sense of beloved and coveted, and popular in the sense of what was consumed by most people. Right. Those are actually two different questions. So the question originally was, what was the most consumed meat of that age? I'm going to go with chicken followed by pork, probably. What was the most sought after material for garments in the 15th century? Oh, yeah. It was either silk or wool, depending. The most sought after wool was something we would call doeskin. It's called at the time broadcloth. And that's actually what I'm working with here. I'm working with doeskin broadcloth. And that's because it looks like someone has managed to turn wool into satin. It's light, it's flexible, it glows in the light. And it's absolutely stunning. And it's smooth and silky as could be. But then after that, silk is the material and the most coveted. The most expensive of silks was, of course, cloth of gold, which is literally silk interwoven with silk threads that have had gold foil wrapped around them so that you actually end up with real gold in your fabric. And then after cloth of gold, probably velvet and cut velvet, figured velvet, multi-level high-low velvet. So you've got piles where they've actually carved by hand, carved patterns into it so that some of the velvet is higher than other parts of the velvet. High-low velvet or cloth of gold velvet actually might be the most coveted, where you actually have cloth of gold interwoven with silk velvet pile. Stunning stuff. I actually have an imitation silk velvet gold, cloth of gold, for one of my giornea. It's real metal, but not gold, and it's not silk for the velvet, but it looks like it, and it's stunning. Peasants can't read. Okay, let's drop the word peasant. Peasants could read. Peasants were absolutely literate because there were public schools even in the Middle Ages in most of Europe. Peasants could read, especially by the 15th century. But I'd like us, you need to move away from the word peasant because I think many of you are using the word peasant as a synonym for serf or for slave, and that's just not true. Peasant comes from the French word paysan, which means farmer, which means a person who lives in the country and works the fields, right? Peasants were not poor, but automatically. They were also not illiterate automatically, and they were not slaves automatically. The word peasant, as Dr. Kim Bowes said in this fantastic medievalist.net podcast on the ancient Roman economy for the 90%, the word peasant does a lot of heavy lifting for us. It does a lot of thinking for us. You say the word peasant, I say the word peasant, and it automatically conjures something for you that is not accurate for probably any specific era except for maybe the pre-Russian Revolution. So yeah, the word peasant is not shorthand for anyone not noble. Like that's another misapprehension, that the opposite of aristocrat is peasant. No, just not. And you know, that the opposite of aristocrat is merchant. Well, also not, because we had aristocrats who were merchants. So you know, you have to kind of drop your misconceptions and maybe flush away these preconceived categories that are not applicable. We have to accept that there are not clear boundaries necessarily between the social classes, that there are not necessarily clear lines between the eras, right? This is, unfortunately, modern humans want clarity. We want black and white. We don't like existing in the gray spaces, but the reality is that life is full of gray spaces, and that applies to history as well. So there are plenty of examples of peasants who could read. They kept their own books. They generated profits. They lived very comfortable lives. Shellback Bo, welcome back. Happy New Year. Lovely to see you. Marquetta Pruitt says, we should be our own women, not some man's pet, 100%. Oh goodness, I have felt so far behind. Have you found reference to eating barnacle geese during Lent? I have. So I've heard of Kelly Listenby, and I'm sorry. Okay, so everyone, as you know, for those of you who know me, welcome to my live stream, The Creative Contessa, Medieval Sewing Party Time. I get on a tangent and I basically hold forth on the topic like a mini lecture, and then I check the chat again, by which point the chat has moved on. So I'm not ignoring your comments, but you're asking some very good questions that require a more in-depth answer. Have I found references to eating barnacle geese during Lent? So I have heard, no, I have not found that referenced in an actual primary source. I have heard people say that. I've heard that urban legend. I have never seen documentation for barnacle geese specifically being allowable and eaten during Lent. So if any of you have found primary source evidence, i.e. an expense account or a chronicle describing a feast held during, or a meal held during Lent, or some kind of sermon that says barnacle geese indeed are allowed to be eaten during Lent, then let me know. I have not seen any primary source evidence of barnacle geese being eaten during Lent. So I'd be interested to know where that rumor comes from. Since it was thought they could be born of the sea, they could be consumed. Yeah, so that's another thing that that's another commonly stated thing about the Middle Ages. But again, I would want to see the primary source evidence that that is actually something that happened. I've read lots of I've heard lots of modern people say that. I haven't actually seen it in a primary source. So, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means I haven't confirmed it myself. Whatever the medieval times is, you look like you could be from it. Thank you. I'll take that as a compliment. Let me see. Joseon era. The Middle Ages is also a very Eurocentric timeline. Yeah, shellback bow, 100%. Because, you know, the term the Middle Ages implies that it's an age between two eras, right? So what is the two eras between which it is? That's relevant for Europe. That's not relevant for Africa necessarily, depending on your part of Africa. Northern Africa, sure, because there's eras, right? There's the Roman era, maybe there's the modern, the Turkish, the Ottoman Empire, for instance. So maybe that could be the Middle Ages for Northern Africa between those two eras. What's the Middle Ages for Japan? What's the Middle Ages for Korea, right? Is the Koryo era the Middle Ages, the era between unified Shilla and Joseon, right? So yeah, no, 100% medieval term. And that's another reason that I think historians are starting to move away from it, because it's so narrow. It's such a narrow term that really only applies to Europe and Western Europe, not necessarily even Eastern Europe, depending on how you look at it. Let me see. The university professor of my medieval history class was of the opinion that the Middle Ages ended with the French Revolution. Controversial, but interesting. Yeah, so I actually, when I was in high school, my history teacher also said that the Middle Ages ended because that was the last bit of serfdom in Europe. But then there's Russia, which had serfs actually until the end of the 19th century, until the abolishment of serfs in that era. I think it was Alexander, or not the end of the 19th century, middle of the second half of the 19th century, Tsar Alexander, right? So yeah, it's a question of what is it you define as medieval. But I mean, that's just it. Like the Middle Ages maybe continued in France for that long, right? But that doesn't mean that they continued in all of Europe for that long. Europe is not a monolith. Yeah. Nor does feudalism look the same from region to region and time to time. It does not at all. Nope. And there's even some controversial theories being put out there that feudalism did not last as long as people thought it did, think it did, and it was definitely did not cover as much of Europe as people thought it did. Said Professor was French, of course. I stick to the definition of from the fall of Rome to the fall of Rome. That's possibly fair, but you know, I mean, that's still arbitrary because the fall of Rome is not the fall of Rome, right? The Roman Senate continues to sit until the Justinian plague. So that for me is actually when the fall of Rome happens. It's the Justinian plague that brings the Western Empire to an end, not the Ostrogoth invasion. I just scrolled to watch a cute lady sew clothes, not a socio-political chat. Okay. Mushrooms are so delicious. I'm honestly surprised that royals didn't make all mushrooms property of the royals. I enjoy venison, but I love mushrooms. Yeah, it could be because it would be very hard to regulate mushrooms. They literally will just grow anywhere when the conditions are right. So that might be the reason that the royals didn't restrict mushrooms. They, never make a law that's not enforceable. That would be kind of unenforceable. Let me see. So the king and only the aristocrats hunted in open areas for food and sport. Okay, so here's the problem with statements like that. Which part of Europe are you talking about and when? Because those rules are not the same across the board for the entire Middle Ages. England has a different policy about royal hunting preserves, and it starts in a different time and picks up different levels of strictness, shall we say, as time goes on than other places. But in many places, yeah, hunting if in the preserves, not I'll say all the forests, but in specifically the royal forests, which in England were pretty copious. If you were caught hunting there, you were a poacher and you would receive a very severe penalty. Sometimes death, if you're lucky, if you're unlucky, they might just cut off your hands, for instance. Isn't that nice? I recently watched a video about how medieval commoners protected themselves. It was very dangerous. They relied mostly on harsh public punishment like stockades and ruined reputation as deterrences. Stay for this, come for the sewing, stay for the socio-political discussions. Yeah, I'm afraid with me, it's always going to turn socio-political at some point. Yeah. Rivers are not real. Looking at you, Elba. Right. Oh, let me see. Oh, goodness. Okay, I've gotten behind in the chat. I am so sorry, everyone. Oh, is it the 12th? Is today 12th night? No, tomorrow is 12th night, right? Today's the 4th. Tomorrow is 12th night, right? Scroll back further. Nope. Let me see. If a village couldn't afford to hire a sheriff, the men had to take turns working the watch at night. Yeah, the history of civil order and maintaining civil order is a very interesting one, and it's not as straight a line as people would like to say. You know, I've heard some people in knowledgeable in accents of knowledge that the Victorians were the first to invent the modern, what we would recognize as the modern day police force, and that is absolutely not true. Depending on when and where you are across Europe, from the ancient times to the modern day, they did have police forces of various kinds. So yeah, it depends on when and where you are. Sometimes you just have a coroner and you've got sheriffs and a constable. Sometimes you actually have actual officers. So yeah, you can't assume that again, Europe is not a monolith. The Middle Ages is not a monolith. Today's the 5th. Is it, Shellback Bow? Is it really? Is today the 5th? Oh goodness. Yep, it is. It's the 5th. Happy 12th night, everyone. So 12th night is a very interesting phenomenon. So in the Middle Ages, 12th night was the day on which gifts were actually exchanged or given, because that is the day on which, that is the Feast of the Epiphany is the feast that, on the 6th technically, but 12th night is, you know, represents the day on which the Magi were supposed to come and present gifts to the newborn Messiah. And so that is where the tradition of gift giving actually originates in Europe, is from that tradition of the Magi having brought all of these riches to the infant Jesus. And so the 12 days of the 12 raucous, ribald, and absolutely decadent revelry that happened during Christmas concludes in the most raucous and ribald of them all, the 12th night feast and celebration. And it actually, that is when gifts were exchanged. And I mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again. Elizabeth I of England, the Duke of Anjou was apparently courting her, and she didn't want him to court her. She wanted him to go away. And so she actually said to him that, because he was apparently also very parsimonious, he was frugal to the point of miserly. And so she suggested to him that if he went home now, it was like the 28th of December, right? If he went home now, he wouldn't have to spend money on a gift for her. And wouldn't that be excellent for his sense of frugality? So she was hoping that that would trigger him to leave. Not only did he not leave, he got her a pendant like this that was shaped like a ship, and he stayed until February. Oh well, good try. Yeah. But I think, you know, the more I read from primary sources, the more you realize that the medieval world was not lawless like we think it is. For instance, there's a new article on medievalist.net about military order and regulations in the Middle Ages, in the first millennium specifically. And it starts in ancient Rome, pointing out how in the late Western Roman Empire, or starting in like the 1st century, the Roman Empire started passing all of these regulations governing soldier behavior, including regulating actions such as illegally confiscating and stealing and looting goods from the homes of people without your commander's consent, right? And there were serious punishments for this. So it was all about maintaining order and making it so that your army is not just a bunch of thugs going through the countryside and destroying the order. Because if you think about it, if these soldiers just become thugs and start stealing from, say, the farmers, who's going to make the food that you're going to eat? Right? Because the farmers will then starve, their fields will be in ruin, and then there will be no food in the next year. So, I mean, it makes sense. But what's interesting, everyone thinks, oh, the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire falls, Europe falls to chaos. And that is apparently not true at all. And we especially imagine these marauding soldiers just running roughshod all over Europe until, I don't know, the 16th century, the 17th century, when the rise of the standing army, right? That's the imagining. Not true for the first millennium. There are plenty of law codes that have survived, interestingly, from across Central Europe, regulating the army and the soldiers and the officers in the army and providing stiff penalties if these rules of conduct are not adhered to. And many of these rules of conduct would absolutely fit in any modern army. For instance, soldiers were not allowed in what was rapidly becoming the Duchy of Bavaria in the 6th century. They pass a whole code of laws governing soldiers. It's called the Lex Bayuvarorium. Lex Bayuvarorium. Sorry, it's a tongue twister of a Latin word. And in it, it contains strictures that have clearly just been taken straight over, adopted clean across from the ancient Roman regulations, from the regulations of the very recently defunct Western Roman Empire. And it states things such as, if you kill a peasant, for instance, a farmer, and it is not with the consent of your commander, then you will be put to death. Like, oh, really? Okay. If you steal and maraud and loot without the consent of your commander, you will be very severely punished. In many cases, death. And this legal framework for the conduct of soldiers in these armies spans across. It runs from France to Germany, and I haven't looked beyond that whether the armies in Visigoth Spain were regulated in a similar way, but I'm going to bet they probably were. So yeah, I think we need to stop. We need to move away from our idea that the medieval world was chaos, that it was a lawless time, and that everyone just lived in fear, worrying when the next marauder was going to come their way. I think we need to revise that interpretation. Let me see. Oh, Shellbackbow, have a good day at work. Neva says the laws existed, but were always difficult to enforce and frequently violated. The intent was there, but the military discipline and loyalties, not so much. Again, it depends on when and where you're talking about, right? For instance, I know that they were enforced in the post-Charlemagne Empire in France, because we have records of people being executed for violating the rules. So, the degree to which they're enforced is going to vary, but the point is that it wasn't just a lawless time, and the fact that they were enforced, that people were executed, says that they were enforced. How consistently? That's a different question, but my impression is much more consistently, just in reading these accounts, much more consistently than many of us would assume, right? I mean, we have a lot of laws now. How consistently are they enforced? In the United States? Across all socioeconomic and racial lines, huh? Are they? The mercenaries of the Hundred Years' War was in Fetch. Oh, well, no, the 15th century. No, I'm talking of the first millennium. 15th century in France. The Armagnacs. Oof, brutal stuff. Yeah, no, 100%. That's because France was weak. The reality is that France was weak during the 100 Years' War. So, yeah. Yeah, no. That's why I say your mileage will vary heavily across this massive 1,000-year period that we conveniently refer to as the Middle Ages. But I think that people I think the default should not be imagining that it is a lawless place, that you can just get away with murder. I know that people couldn't just get away with murder in many different places in many different times of the Middle Ages, because I have read At this point, hundreds of cases of murderers being identified and tried after investigation, right? Actually, an evidential investigation. I'm not talking about the bullshit trial by ordeal. No, no, no. I mean actual evidential investigation. So I think we need to accept that it isn't as lawless as many people assume it is once you really start getting into the documentary evidence. Let me see. Do we have any? If I could have a title, I would want the title either Orange Navarre or Anjou. Yeah. Now, there were absolutely still bandit groups. I mean, not much, if you think about it, not much has changed, right? We still have bandit groups. They're called gangs. We still have people who violate the laws all the time, and that's why we have a justice system. So, I think that in many cases, people's imagining of the Middle Ages as a lawless time is mostly, again, post-medieval propaganda trying to prop themselves up as being somehow superior to the people who came before. To change the topic, what were the most used medicinal herbs in the Middle Ages? Oof. So medicinal herbs depend very much on your local area, right? So if you, unfortunately for people receiving pharmaceutical treatments in the Middle Ages, gems were some of the most expensive and most highly rated, they're not medicinal herbs, but medicinal minerals, because it was considered that the talismanic properties that they contained would be more beneficial if you ground them up and consumed them. But that was obviously for the elite of society. That is for the elite of society. I would say, the medicinal herbs. Pennyroyal and rue make a lot of appearances in the medicinal concoctions that I've seen mentioned. Let me see other herbs that are pretty common in the medicinal. The thing is that herbs are very local, unlike the modern world where we have freshly farmed food shipped in across thousands upon thousands of miles. Freshly farmed things didn't often get shipped that far. Herbs were not, you're not probably getting fresh herbs. Anyway, you're not getting fresh herbs from, Constantinople up in London. You're getting dried herbs possibly, but not fresh herbs. And medicine very often relies heavily on fresh herbs. So it really would depend on what is locally available. But I know that in a lot of the medicinal texts that I have read, rue and pennyroyal play a really big part. They crop up quite a bit. Yeah. Yeah, depending on the type of stone mine. Yeah, so Nevis, absolutely different stones. But at the end of his life, Lorenzo the Magnificent, Lorenzo de Medici, consumed, like in one sitting, he consumed like something like 1,000 pearls worth of ground pearls in like a week or something like that. It was pretty alarming. Oh God. Now granted, pearls I think are mostly calcium carbonate, right? Don't hold me to that. I'm trying to remember offhand what the chemical makeup of pearls are, but I think it's mostly calcium. So maybe not the worst thing you could grind up and consume. Certainly better than grinding up and consuming rubies, which was also done. So yeah. Oh, fun times. Yeah, but Nevis, you might have actually read medicinal treatises in more depth for a comparative perspective than I have. What is your opinion on the most common medicinal herbs? In my head, rue and pennyroyal are really sticking out. Yeah, pearls are comparatively inert, right? Yeah, there's yeah, don't consume copper. Unfortunately, towards the end of the Middle Ages, especially when alchemy is really starting to pick up steam, elements such as mercury were considered to be highly medicinal and highly powerful and potent because of the strange and seemingly magical properties of things like mercury, which means that you start seeing it increasingly as a treatment for a wide array of common afflictions such as gout and sexually transmitted infections like syphilis, and for other a variety of other ills. Unfortunately for the people who took the mercury for the treatment of said ills. Yeah. Arsenic was also, again, that's not an herb though, it's a mineral. So arsenic was also makes a frequent appearance. So does lead. Lead makes a frequent appearance. Mint and purslane. Yeah, purslane, I have seen purslane a lot too. Plantain. So plantain, a lot of people don't even know what plantain is anymore because now it's just a weed, right? Almost no one grows plantain anymore. But plantain actually does have some positive medicinal properties. So that is, I just don't recall seeing plantain that often myself. But yeah, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. Yep. And the reality is that a lot of these herbs are, in fact, they have a lot of really positive pharmacological properties, which is why the compounds were eventually isolated in mostly the 19th century and then synthesized, like the active compounds from those herbs were isolated and synthesized. The problem is that the synthetic version of those actives does not take into account the symbiotic relationship of the so-called active compound with the so-called inactive compounds that provide the structure and matrix and framework for the active, and how by extracting the active, you're not necessarily actually getting the full impact, positive impact of the herb itself. Yeah, so I'm going to completely say that herbalism is not my strong suit, and that actually, as the lady of the house, I need to do a lot more. I need to look more at Catherine Tolomaka's Book of Secrets and see what she has. So I don't recall exactly what plantain's major benefits are. I just know that I remember reading it years ago and going, wow, that seems to be a kind of general remedy. Not a panacea in the sense that it will heal everything, but in the sense of it can be used to treat a variety of complaints and possibly be effective. Let me see. I think it is a matter of a lot of commoner and cunning plant and herb food supplements in food that were not written down. Yeah, there's also that. But thankfully, we do have these books of secrets. So if you want to do research into medieval medicinal, sort of more work-a-day medieval medicinal practices, look for books of secrets. Ladies kept them generally. Sometimes men did as well. Generally, the ladies of the house kept them, and they're basically their home companion, their own personal book of their own tips and tricks for running a good household. And these books of secrets cover a wide array of topics, everything from finger loop braiding, from lace making, to medicine, to household maintenance, to gardening, to proper ways to exercise, to cosmetics, right? These books of secrets are absolute treasure troves of sort of more of work-a-day items like this, because they come from the daily lives of real women who actually lived and used them, rather than many of the medieval treatises and tracts that are designed to either impress a king and get the author hired as their court whatever, or they might have some kind of political bias. We don't know. But the books of secrets are actually very much representative of daily life experience. Obviously, if they're writing a book of secrets, they're not beggars in the streets. But books of secret are not just kept by noble women, they were also kept by middle-class women managing a household. So yeah, definitely a very valuable book. Now, another way the Medieval Home Companion, the Ménagier de Paris, actually contains a whole bunch of medicinal recommendations, as I recall. So that would be another good place to get an idea of, what the average kind of middle-class person considered for their medicinal applications. Yeah, point being, a lot of herbs such were workaday medicine and not necessarily recorded as academic medicine or precursor to pharmacology. Yeah, that's definitely part of the problem, is that a lot of the medicinal tracts are going to focus on the expensive ingredients, the impressive, right? The big ticket ingredients, it's like the snail mucus and gold flakes of of the Middle Ages, right? That's where they're going to focus their efforts rather than in the more workaday stuff, which is why books of secrets are great for that. Oh yeah, Paracelsus. So Paracelsus and Marsilio are both 16th century, right? Um, so that's almost what you might consider post-medieval, depending on your perspective. Yeah, but still, I'm not saying that they necessarily invented everything that they write about completely themselves, but just beware that the 16th century, is also a time of innovation. So, and Paracelsus and Marsilio are basically experimenting, right? Ficino is heavy in the intersectional magic. Well, as I point out to people, it can be tricky to separate magic from health in the pre-modern world, right? Yeah, Paracelsus crops up a lot, has cropped up a lot in my life because of his his contributions to modern chemistry, right? Like, he's kind of in some ways considered the first European chemist. And he's the first to really start that's at least for the facile version of history, that's sort of the role he plays, for those who don't know that. Where are you from? That's a complicated question. Where am I right now? I'm currently in Daegu, South Korea. I am, however, from the small state of Delaware in the United States, but I haven't lived there in a very long time. I have lived all over the world. I travel the world on a regular basis. So where I'm from is a different question. If you're asking how I'm dressed, that's yet another question. I'm currently in my second half of the 15th century Anglo-French, Anglo-Franco-Burgundian casual. So like 1450 to 1470 French casual, basically. It's French for a noblewoman who's in her private home. Yep. So yeah, that's the answer. Where I'm from is a complicated question. Nevis says Ficino was studying specifically magic. He has an entire book on combining astrological magic with natural medicine. And of course, astrology plays a big role in pre-modern medicine, not just in Europe, in the Middle East, and even in Asia, in the Orient, right? So a lot of people forget that a lot of the advances, or maybe are unaware, not forget is the wrong word. A lot of modern people are unaware that many of the scientific advancements of the last 1500 years or more have been originated with the search to better understand the stars for the function of astrology, and to better predict and plan great events and the best time to administer certain treatments. And so the astrolabe is part of that. So yeah, astrology, despite its modern ill reputation, has actually played a big role in scientific advancement in Eurasia. Yeah. A huge role, kind of, because there was no electricity. Oh, darn it, played a huge role. Reptiles, I'm sorry, what played a huge role because there was no electricity? Unfortunately, your comment arrived probably after I finished saying the thing in which it was, so now I'm curious. So I'm curious because I would like to actually expand on your point, because I'm certain your point is very, very valid and deserves expanding upon. But what played a huge role because there were no electric lights? Yeah, so how did no electric lights affect? That was my point. Yeah. Mathematics and astrology used to be basically the same academic subject. Yep. 100%. It was part of the quadrivium, right? Yeah. Pretty certain it was the quadrivium. Yep. So for those who are interested in cooking, because people were inquiring about cooking, note on my Travels with the Creative Contessa channel, I started yesterday a weekly series on cooking from around the world. So this is not so much historical, but modern traditional cuisines that I have encountered in my vast travels that I have taught myself and or learned in that country how to cook. And so I'm going to cook them with you. So if you're interested, not just in historical cooking, but modern cooking from a wide array of places around the globe, check out my Travels with the Creative Contessa channel and Cooking from Around the World. That is a new series I started yesterday. We did Korean dak galbi. I showed you how to make that from scratch. There's still a bunch in my fridge, so guess what's happening for lunch and dinner for in the next couple of days? Oh, astrology. Oh, astrology, you think because there were no electric lights that astrology was, I don't think the electricity or lack of electric lights had anything to do with astrology, honestly. I don't think that really played much of a role. Oh, not quite done. Not quite done. Almost done with this seam. Electric, it's funny, yeah, so actually, if you could, maybe reptiles, if you could expound how you think electric lights tied in, or a lack of electric lights tied into the prevalence of astrology, I'd be interested to hear that connection, because I'm clearly something I think I'm missing, a connection I'm missing. Yep. Okay. There we go. One final seam here, show you how the progress is coming on this sleeve. You can see, yes, there we go. You can see the little whip stitches holding that seam open. So now it will lay nice and flat and not bulk out. Just a couple of more whip stitches and we're good on this side. I think astrology and agriculture were connected, but not sure about the math. Oh, yeah. Well, there's, astrology. I'm trying. That triggers my memory. There is a book, a 15th century English book, a manual of agriculture. I don't remember the name of it, but it actually tells you how to plant, how to sow your seed, when to plant, and I'm pretty certain it mentions something about the astrological orientation. We could see the stars if we were not so polluted with lights on the ground. Oh, I see what you're saying. Right. So because there's a lack of light pollution, it allows us to have a more intimate connection with the heavens. Got it. I agree with that 100%. Yep. You do not need much astrology to understand the lunar speed and phases. Yep, that's true too. True as well. Astrology is extremely math heavy. Yep. Yeah, especially if you go based on the geocentric. God, if your astrology is based on a geocentric model of the universe, oh yeah, all of those paracycles that are needed to explain the motion of the heavenly bodies when you put the Earth at the center, instead of the sun at the center, maybe not of the universe, but of our solar system. Yeah, that's some, you definitely need some complex math there. Like most of calculus and trigonometry actually comes out of astrology. Calculus, finding the area under the curve, comes out of astrology. I never thought about that. Oh, there was something I wanted to bring up. Oh, yeah. Not related at all to the topic of astrology. I wanted to briefly readdress the topic of leather in medieval clothing. So someone rightly asked in one of the comments under my video where I bemoan the horrible state of medieval material culture in most Hollywood productions or even popular television productions. And I mentioned one of the issues that I have with many of them, or most of them, is that they depict men especially, but sometimes women, leather. Everyone's in leather, and lots of leather trousers and leather doublets and leather jerkins and leather. And someone asked me, well, wouldn't leather be a reasonable and common choice for clothing in the Middle Ages? No, it is not, for many reasons. Leather was just not as available then as it is now. One, two, leather is not as easy to make as some people think. Someone commented that as long as you have a pig, anyone can kill a pig, skin it, and tan leather. No, not anyone can tan leather. I'm sorry. Tanning was a highly technical was and is a highly technical profession. It requires a lot of expertise. It requires chemistry knowledge to do properly. Tanning a hide is not just as simple as skinning the animal and letting the hide dry. That's rawhide. So, and even then you have to process it beyond that. So no, not anyone who had a pig could just have leather garments. You had to be a professional tanner. Tanner was a profession for a reason. That's why we have people now with the last name of Tanner, because someone in their ancestry did nothing, specialized in nothing but tanning hides. But more specifically, the rate of animal slaughter in the Middle Ages, in the pre-modern era, in the pre-20th century era, is just nothing like the slaughter of animals now. There just weren't as many hides available from which to make leather, which means that what leather you did have needed to be prioritized. And the first choice for leather in the Middle Ages, honestly, is going to be shoes. It's going to be shoes. It's not going to be clothes. It's going to be shoes. And then it's going to be harness. It's going to be things you need for fighting garments, for operating, riding and or driving horses and oxen, right? You're going to need leather for shoes and for harness and saddlery. You're not going to want it. You're not going to have a lot that you can use on lots and lots of leather clothes. Now, and also a lot of hides are not used for leather. They're turned into vellum, depending on the animal in question. Sheepskin probably went to vellum. We know that certain goat skin was a very highly prized shoe leather, but also we have goat skin vellum, right? So it's either leather, but it's just as often going to be vellum, because the demand for vellum in the medieval book industry was massive, and you needed a lot of it. So there just isn't the availability of hides to turn into leather to make sure that there's enough leather for everyone to have leather garments. Were there leather garments? Yes. Very few, though. How do we know? We know from the archaeological record where very few leather garments survive. But more importantly, from the documentary evidence, where we have thousands of pages of expense accounts, of inventories, of wills, and the appearance of leather garments in all of those is so rare as to be literally remarkable, as in something that a fashion historian would actually remark upon because it's so unusual. So yeah, it's not that there weren't leather garments, it's that they weren't nearly as common as these modern productions would have you believe. But most importantly, leather trousers, not a thing for most of the medieval periods being depicted in these depictions, right? Just not a common thing, or barely a thing at all. So, most men from the period from, gosh, the 9th century to the 16th century, the 1500, most men are going to be wearing either trews, sort of trousers, but that's much earlier on. That's the first millennium, of wool, possibly linen, but more likely wool, or hosen of wool or silk, occasionally linen, but more likely wool. And they're not going to be trousers like we would recognize them for most of the high and late Middle Ages in Western Europe. Men are wearing hosen. I'm sorry, and I think that's part of the problem, is that the kind of way that men were covering their legs and butts is not acceptable by standards of modern masculinity. And so invariably you have Prince Henry in the movie Ever After, which is otherwise excellent for late 15th, early 16th century fashion. You have Prince Henry in leather trousers, right? Even though he shouldn't be, he should be in hosen. So yeah, I think that's why they often depict these men in leather trousers, because leather is manly and trousers are manly, and they don't care about medieval or not medieval, right? Yeah. So just wanted to get that out there again. Let me see. Shoes followed by belts and containers like purses and sheaths. Yeah, as Nevis says, while leather vests and jerkins seem to have been popular at the end of the Middle Ages through the early modern Germany, but I don't know of leather pants. And popular is, yeah, that's like the very, very end. We're talking the 15th century, and that's like the second half of the 15th century. But even if you look at the expense accounts, there's just not lots of leather there. it's not. And often the leather garments that are described are a kind of fusion between leather and fabric, not just leather. Yeah, the jerkin thing, like vests and jerkins, that's not really, you're talking about doublets, or you're talking about, jerkin is not really a thing in much of the 15th century. It's more into the 16th century is what you're talking about, which for me is, I'm not talking about movies in the 16th century. I'm not looking at movies in the 16th century at all. For me, 1500 is my cutoff for medieval productions. After that, once you get into the Reformation, it's no longer medieval, right? So then you're just kind of getting into historical productions and how accurate they are or not. But when I was, my complaint was mostly about productions up to 1500. You do start seeing more leather in the 16th century than you do at all in any of the eras before that. And even then, the preponderance of evidence points to fabric clothing, not leather clothing. Yeah. So I stand by that. And also, leather was dyed. Even if they did have a leather doublet, for instance, we have so much evidence that leather was dyed bright, beautiful colors also. Now, they wouldn't be as bright as silk because it's leather. It's not going to take dyes necessarily in the same way, but we have dyeing manuals from the 14th and the 15th, 12th through the 15th century that talk about dyeing leather. And it seems that the common thing was to dye leather. Now that could be for shoes, but I'm going to bet that they would want a nice brightly colored leather garment as well if they were going to have a leather garment. Medieval people loved color. They loved color, they loved color, they loved color. I want to emphasize that across all levels of society, people had colored clothes. I'm sorry. There's this other weird thing that it keeps popping up in the comments, and I haven't been able to track it to an actual medieval source. People keep saying, oh, well, the peasants broke out their colored clothes only to go to church on Sunday. First off, you didn't only go to church on Sunday. You heard mass every day, not just on Sunday. And also, I'm unfamiliar with a passage that talks about you only wear your colored dyed clothes to church on Sunday and the rest of the week you wear your undyed clothes, I guess, because that's the other thing. Brown is a color also, actually. Linen is not naturally brown. It's actually gray natural. It's kind of unhealthy looking gray color. Wool is not naturally brown unless it comes from black sheep. But, the preponderance of wool, as far as we can tell, in medieval sheep industry was, a kind of creamy colored wool, right? So brown is not a natural color. You still have to use dye stuffs that are expensive to make brown. Black is the most expensive color of all to dye fabric. So yeah, I'm sorry, but brown and tan, you still have to dye your fabric to get brown and tan. So again, they only use their dyed clothes at church on Sunday. If any of you have actually found a primary source, medieval citation that talks about people wearing only their single suit of dyed clothing to church on Sunday, let me know. I've not been able to track that rumor down. I've seen it repeated a lot in the comments, and I've heard people say it before. Yeah. Let me see. Where do you learn all this anyway? Where have I learned all this? I have spent most of my life reading history books, and not just other people's versions of history, but I mean primary source history. I read inventories, I read expense accounts, I read chronicles from the era, I read letters, I read diaries, I read journals, I read archaeology reports, right? So yeah, I've learned this all from primary sources. I don't trust other people's interpretations of history generally. What is your headpiece called? Is it religious? No, this is a kerchief. It is absolutely not religious. It is a practical garment. If it's sunny out, as you see, I just turned the brim forward. This helps keep this glare out of my face. And if I pull it even further forward, then it keeps the sun off of my face, right? So very practical for the sunlight. It keeps my hair covered, which means my hair stays clean when I'm, because there's lots of dust and detritus in the air. So it helps keep my hair clean, especially in a world lit only by fire and heated only by fire, where there's going to be soot floating in the air. So this will help keep my hair clean. Men also covered their hair in various ways. This is not religious at all. It is 100% secular and practical. Yep. Good question. Thank you for asking. I've been wondering how leather is dyed recently. Pretty much everything other than maybe their base layers were dyed for peasants. Yeah, 100%. The only layer that was not dyed is the base layer, your undershirt, this thing, the smock. This is, and it's not undyed, it's bleached. I mean, it is undyed, but it's not natural. This is bleached. Linen is not white like this. As I said, linen is normally an unhealthy shade of gray if it's left to its own devices. Let me see. I've been wondering how leather is dyed recently. Yeah, medieval leather dyeing is a disgusting process. It was stinky. Remember, the tanning works and the dyeing works were often legislated in a variety of communities to be on the edge of town so that they would not make the center of town smell bad, because that's how noxious leather tanning was specifically. And even dyeing was not necessarily the best smelling activity, specifically because of the fermented urine that was often a key part of the dyeing process. Yeah, let me see. It's the modern idea of Sunday best mixed with misinformation. Yeah, Villa Vendetta, that's the best I can see. Like, yeah, yeah. Great, so open the pores of the leather and dye it with a reactive metal. Was there a lot of green leather infused with copper? I'm trying to remember what was used to dye leather green. I don't remember offhand what the dye stuff, how leather was turned green. For fabric, it's a two-step process. You do a base of blue, like woad maybe, or indigo, depending on your era, specifically in the Middle Ages, and then you over dye with yellow, and that's how you get green. So I'm not certain. It might be the same for leather as well. Your pendant is beautiful. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Sunzi Hollingsworth. Really appreciate it. This is an Armor and Castings pendant. If you can certainly go to armorandcastings.com. If you use the code Contessa10, you'll get an extra 10% off. Their jewelry, their replica medieval jewelry, is super affordable, extremely well made, and very durable. Yep. I think green is the period leather color we know the least about. As far as I know, it appears to have been a thing based on some period artwork, but we do not know much at all what they would have used to. Nevis, I'm pretty certain I have seen a recipe for dyeing leather green in the same source that also contains a bunch of laundry hints. I'll have to see if I can dig that up. White is also easily stained. Yes, it is. Yes, it is, which is why you want this layer to be washable, 100%. Okay, everyone. Well, I have finished the seam here, right? You can see of the sleeve, and I'll stand back so you can see what this is. This is the sleeve for my new Burgundian gown. I will turn it the correct way around and put it on so you can get an idea of what it will look like when it is all finished. Right, okay. Yeah, I think this is my right sleeve. Okay. So as you see, we've got the over the knuckles look. So as I wish once, now granted, this is going to lose some edge when I turn it. So keep that in mind. We've got the over the knuckles look, and then I can always turn that back. I will be lining this probably with a velvet cuff, a nice silk velvet cuff, right? So that's how you get that cuff look. And as you can see, because I cut this sleeve out of two pieces, it creates a really nice fitted look. You've got someone called the skinny arm look right on the dress, and so that the sleeves fit the curves of my very muscular arms really nicely. And then here on the sleeve cap, on the arm's eye, you can see that comes up and over my equally muscular shoulder, right? And you can see how that's going to fit over, how it fits nicely over top of this somewhat bulky woolen kirtle so that it will actually fit and stay on my shoulder. Yep. So even with my arm down, you can see how far that actually still stays on my shoulder instead of pulling the sleeve off, right? Which is very important. Yeah, okay, what do you all think of the new sleeve for the new dress? Yeah, feels really nice. It feels like my arm is being hugged by the sleeve, right? I'm just here to talk shit because I'm feeling extra salty tonight. Sure, Mr. Whale. Peel away. Yeah, so a Burgundian gown, for those who don't know what a Burgundian gown is, on my YouTube channel, if you go look up Burgundian, you'll see plenty of depictions of it. I have lots of shorts, and I have a whole getting dressed video of getting dressed from the skin out. Yes, it is a little saucy, but not too saucy, not enough to violate community standards. I have an entire video, 26 minutes long, getting dressed from the skin out into all the layers, including the Burgundian overgown with the iconic, princess hat, right? What you would call the princess hat, which was at the time called a mitre. So if you want to see the Burgundian gown, it's the typical French-ish style gown that's worn with this conical hat. And it's referred to in modern costuming circles as a Burgundian gown because the Duchy of Burgundy was in the 15th century the most powerful political entity in Europe and set the fashions pretty much everywhere north of the Alps and even in some places south of the Alps like Portugal. So yeah, and Spain even. So yeah, this is the sleeve that will go with that gown. The rest of the pieces are over here. So now I just have to do the same thing to the other sleeve. I just have to finish the seams, iron them open, and then whip stitch them down. And then that will be a nice comfy sleeve just like this, which will be a new addition to my wardrobe. So yeah. Okay, this darn work. Let me see. Oh, I appreciate that, Mr. Whale. Really appreciate it. Okay, so the bell-bottom cuff is rad. Yeah, pretty nice, right? Pretty elegant. I think it's so elegant. I think the way the cuff kind of comes over the hand, that curve, I think the curves are sexy. The curves are sexy. Hashtag sexy curved sleeves, right? I love the look of this particular sleeve in this era. I never heard of that before. I just learned a new thing today. Oh, awesome. Fantastic. Okay, everyone. Well, are there any final comments or questions before we part ways for the day? Keep your eye on, I'm going to go ahead and schedule a bunch of live streams for the week. We will have a medieval story time during which I will read to you passages from a variety of primary medieval sources. So in other words, voices from the era talking about their own era. Amongst them will be some of Christine de Pizan's rules for ladies and how to live their lives and how to conduct themselves. And of course, we'll do more medieval sewing parties. There will be another medieval cooking party probably this weekend. And if you're interested in modern traditional cuisine from around the world, check out Travels with the Creative Contessa, where I'll be doing a weekly cooking show there as well. Let me see. It's nice to have someone to listen and talk to while I'm sewing. I do have a question though. How do you deal with not being able to access period fabric? When you say period fabric, so what do you mean by period? Okay. Final rant, final rabbit hole. Authenticity. Authenticity is a spectrum, right? So there is no bottom to authenticity. So when you say period fabric, do you mean just fabric that's made of natural fibers? Do you mean fabric that is woven on a hand loom? Do you mean fabric that is spun, that consists of threads that were spun from a sheep that existed of a breed that existed in the Middle Ages? So I need you to define period fabric a little more narrowly for me, because I can keep going with that. There is no bottom of authenticity. The true bottom of authenticity is to time travel to the Middle Ages and steal medieval garments and bring them to the present. That is the bottom of authenticity. Otherwise, there's always another level to which you, as a reenactor or a practitioner of living history or a cosplayer, could take your authenticity journey, right? There's always a next level, which is why I get really irritated with these reenactors who claim that they are the authority on what is authentic enough. And I'm like, no, you are the authority for your group. You can define what is authentic enough for your group, but there is no truly authentic. Doesn't exist, short of time travel. Yeah, let me see. You are awesome keeping the cool person you are and making the world much educated. Yeah. So if you're enjoying this and you want to see more, don't forget to like and subscribe, click the notification bell and click all. And I just want a little more. Wool isn't plausible for where I live and linen is also hard to access. I agree completely. I prefer plausible and accurate. Okay. Fantastic, Carrie. Thank you for narrowing it down. Okay. There are a couple, so depending on where you live in the world, there are a couple of tips and tricks for accessing, you're talking about natural fibers basically, right? So wool is not comfortable for you, but Carrie, I'm going to bet that you probably haven't tried a summer weight wool. So a lot of people think that wool automatically always is this wool, right? It's not too thick, but it's also not super thin, right? This is not a summer weight wool. Summer weight wool is woven to be very light and airy and breathes fantastically and is comfortable in, drumroll, tropical places like Thailand. Ask me how I know. I have worn this wool kirtle. I have worn this in Thailand, in the hot part of Thailand, not the highlands of Thailand, and I was perfectly comfortable. Right. So actually wool might not be as uncomfortable as you might think it is in even hot and humid climates. And summer weight wool or light suiting wools are a very good solution if you do want to wear wool, if you want to be authentic and you want to wear wool, right? I would recommend trying a summer weight wool. I think you're going to be shocked at how breathable it is in hot and humid conditions. The key is that you have the linen underlayer against your skin. Now, where can you find linen? Fabricstore.com and fabrics.com are two online sources. Those are in the United States. They have very reasonably priced linen very often, like $6, $7 a yard. It's not the best quality, but it's not the worst quality. Also, you might want to check on eBay in any country you happen to be and check out the curtains. Do a search for linen curtains and verify the fiber content by insisting on a picture of the packaging. But a lot of fashion interior design houses or interior design houses and stores have natural fiber fabrics because rich people like natural fibers. So they actually have linen curtains. And at the end of the season, they might have one or two curtains left, but that's not enough to keep in their store. So they end up going to resellers and being sold on eBay. So you can frequently find real silk and real linen, 100% curtains on eBay that you can then easily turn into garments. And you'll find them for cheaply. And they'll be shipped to you. You don't even have to go shopping for it. Goodwill or other charity shops, depending on where you are in the world, are another really good option. I have often found 100% linen curtains, and I mean top quality linen, at Goodwill, for instance, in the curtain area or the bedding area. IKEA, if you're near an IKEA very often sells linen bedding, and the price of their like massive linen duvets, and they're usually white or cream colored, which is fine, very much less than it would be to buy that same amount of linen on your own. And if you go to the last chance area of an IKEA, frequently they will put the floor items there at a severely reduced price. So we once got a queen size linen duvet made out of like Belgian linen. And this thing, I still have it. It's massive. It's like, I don't know, 4 meters by 4 meters. It's immense. And it's lined. So it's 2 layers of 4 meter by 4 meter linen. And we purchased it for only $40. And it came with 2 beautiful pillowcases. This was one of those pillowcases. It has already been turned into a linen kerchief, right? So there's a couple of different ways that you can source natural fiber fabrics, even if you don't have a good fabric store near you, at reasonable prices. So those are some of my main tips. Yep. Let me see. Ooh. Yeah, so everyone, remember to double tap your screen if you've been enjoying this, of course, at the very end when I start holding forth very enthusiastically. Welcome to my medieval sewing party. I'm the Creative Contessa, and we are coming to the end of our live stream. If you have any questions and I didn't answer them, pop them in the comments when the recording posts, which will be pretty instantly. And if you have enjoyed this, then please like and subscribe, click the notification bell. I would like to thank my patrons and my channel members for supporting my research into medieval material culture and my efforts to bring it to life for not just myself, but for all of you, and to share my lessons learned, my learnings with you in this manner. If you're interested in extra content, because my patrons and my channel members have access to my Creative Contessa Discord, where I share lots of extra resources on a regular basis. They also have access to exclusive videos that I have made that are only accessible to my patrons and channel members, uncut footage, early access to footage, ad-free videos, and things that no one else gets to see, all as a perk of being a channel member or a patron. So if you would like to support my work in that manner, please do. I would like to also thank all of those of you who have left me super chats today and in the past. Again, those of you who are willing and able to go that extra mile and support me financially, I really appreciate that. For the rest of you who are just part of my community, I understand that not everyone has the financial means to support a creator like me, and that's perfectly fine. I'm just grateful to have you all in my community. The questions you asked have been really fantastic, and you know, the way we kind of support each other in this creative approach to history is just a truly beautiful phenomenon. I appreciate all the forms of support, everyone, and even Mr. Wales, who's just feeling salty, but then came and just found, I guess, maybe a moment of beauty. I don't know, hopefully, some peace of mind, I guess. Let me see. The reason everyone used to, yeah, wear linen, it's antibacterial. Okay, everyone. Until next time, may your adventures be creative, and I hope to see you all very soon. Good night, everyone.